Well, we're all quiet, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started. I'll start off with an announcement. I know we just had lunch. The mic's not on? Checking, test, 1, 2, 3. Does it work? Oh, there we go. Now can you hear me, Joe? Okay, so the announcement is, I know we just had lunch, but nap time is scheduled for 2 p.m. during Peter Klein's talk on entrepreneurship. So hold off on your sleeping. So our topic this afternoon is the division of labor and social order. This is an immensely important topic for Mises. If you just flip through human action, the page that you arrive at just randomly is likely to mention the division of labor or cooperation, peaceful cooperation, something about the social nexus, the social economy. So it pervades his entire treatise on economics. So it's extremely important. You also saw that it was mentioned in Dr. Herbiter's lecture right before lunch. And he sort of hinted at it. He talked about the social economy and the division of labor. And what we're going to do in this lecture is elaborate on it. See, why is it so important for Mises? What makes the division of labor more productive? Why does Mises refer to it as society or civilization itself? So those are the sorts of things that we'll be covering. Before we get into it, though, I just want to contrast Mises's view of the division of labor with some common views about the market economy that you often see on the left. You see people say that the market economy is this dog-eat-dog world. It's by nature, it's people having conflicts with one another. It's violence. You hear this sort of terminology. But that is, the exact opposite of how Mises and Austrian economists look at the market economy and the division of labor. In fact, the division of labor is peaceful cooperation. Instead of people, using violence to acquire what they want from other people, so like going over and, bonking them on the head and taking their stuff, instead we cooperate with them peacefully and we trade with them. So there's this expectation of mutual benefit. So I expect that by you giving me what you have, and I give you what I have, we'll both be better off as a result. We both prefer the thing that we're getting over the thing that we're giving up. And so this yields, or at least tends towards, cooperation in the longer run. It's not just a one-off sort of thing, but if I see or anticipate that other people will be producing things that I want, or they'll have things that I want, then I might have an incentive to produce things that they want so that we can keep trading with one another, which means that we don't just get this one-off trade that results in mutual benefit, but we actually get long-lasting social cooperation. We get long-lasting relationships between persons that are beneficial and also increase our standards of living, make us better off. Okay, so you might know that I like children's books. I've written 3 on different economic concepts like the broken window fallacy, Austrian business cycle theory, and I thought maybe I would write one about the division of labor, but lo and behold, there already is one. There's a classic by Richard Scarry called What Do People Do All Day? And it shows what people do all day in Busy Town, right? So they have different jobs, they do different things, and I'll show you some examples from this book. But it just goes to show the fact that this was an appropriate topic for a classic and very popular children's book shows that this is something that's fundamental. It's something that's like very basic to us. The idea that we specialize, the idea that we choose a career, we choose a job, and do that job and then trade with other people. We earn some sort of income by the things that are produced by others. This is something that's almost second nature to us. It's something that we definitely take for granted, but as we'll see later on in the presentation, we shouldn't take it for granted. It's something that we participate in every day, all day, or maybe not all day, because like Professor Herbner said, there is a personal economy. But whenever we're encountering other people in the market and trading with them, it means that we're making use of the division of labor. Okay, so some definitions. I'll define the division of labor as individuals specializing in particular tasks with the intent to trade. So that's important. Both parts of that definition are important. So we're specializing, meaning that we're doing one particular thing. As opposed to trying to produce everything that we want to consume, we decide to specialize. We narrow our focus. We narrow our efforts into producing one particular thing, or even participating in one step of the production of a particular thing. as the division of labor extends and permeates an entire structure of production. So there's that specialization aspect, but there's also that intent to trade, and that's an important element of the division of labor, because if there wasn't that intent to trade, then there wouldn't be a reason for me to specialize. Because I like to consume a variety of goods, right? It means that if I were to be self-sufficient, if I were to be isolated and not participate in this division of labor, if I wanted to do that, it means that I would have to produce my own food, my own shelter, my own medicine, the things that I need to survive. And even that, it's unlikely that I would be able to do that on my own, right? It's the brutal standard of living. However, I specialize in a particular job because I intend to trade the outcome. I intend to trade that product with other people so that I can get from them that variety of goods that I was just speaking about. So the specialization can only occur if there's that intention or that expectation that you'll be able to acquire the variety of goods that you desire from other people. Now, the other part of the title is social order. And if you look through the different ways that Mises uses this term in Human Action, when he's talking about social order, what he's describing is a set of institutions, usually centered around the institution's respect for or neglect for private property, and the social order also refers to the outcome of that. So whether or not we have a harmony or disharmony of interest between the people. In Mises' case is that if you have private property, then people can engage in economic calculation, they can specialize with the intent to trade, therefore we have a division of labor, and that results in this social harmony, this harmony of interest where I'm getting what I want out of the market and you're also getting what you want out of the market, and we're all better off as a result, and everybody's peacefully cooperating. Okay, so like I said, Mises often equates the division of labor with society or civilization. So just one example of that is, he says on page 143, so quite early on in Human Action, society is division of labor and combination of labor. Okay, so let's take a closer look at Richard Scarry's division of labor in Busytown. So I'm sure you can't read all the text there, but we've got some workers work indoors, some work outdoors, some work up in the sky, some work underground. Some workers always do their work at the same place. Others travel from place to do their jobs. And so we get these pictures of a bunch of different characters in Busytown doing different jobs. He says everyone is a worker, and he goes through this example of farmer Alfalfa, who on his farm produces some fruits and vegetables. He sells the fruits and vegetables to Grocer Cat there in the bottom left. And then the Grocer Cat specializes in selling these for retail customers, right? So farmer Alfalfa doesn't spend his time trying to sell it to the final buyers of the fruits and vegetables. He spends his time, he specializes in farming, and then somebody else in Busytown specializes in selling his product to others in the community. We got people doing blacksmithing. Talks about Grocer Cat buying a dress for his mother or her mother. So everybody's doing different things in this economy. And so I know this is sort of childish to look at, but this is what we do all day, right? So that's the title of the book. What do people do all day? This is what we do. We all specialize in a particular task. And as a result of that, we group together, or actually it's not just a result, but it's a prerequisite and a result that we group together in communities. And so that's what Mises means by the division of labor is human civilization. So why do we group together? And it's because we recognize this greater productivity of the division of labor. Okay, another quote from Mises. We owe the origin and development of human society and consequently of culture and civilization to the fact that work performed under the division of labor is more productive than when performed in isolation. So like I said, the opposite of the division of labor is isolation. It's me trying to be self-sufficient. Another opposite, can you have three things that are opposite to each other? I don't know, ask David Gordon. So one opposite is trying to be self-sufficient. That's Robinson Crusoe, alone on his island, producing what he needs. And so his consumption is, or his production is his consumption, right? There's no intent to trade because there's nobody to trade with, at least until somebody else arrives on the island. But the other opposite, the other thing that's not the division of labor is this perpetual conflict. It's when people, instead of viewing each other as other people who are capable of producing and who own their own property and can trade with us for mutual benefit, we view them as somebody we can aggress against, somebody we can commit violence against to acquire the things that we want. And so that's why Mises emphasizes the peacefulness of cooperation in the division of labor. In the earlier quote, you might have noticed that Mises said division and combination of labor. And so there's an interesting example of both in Richard Scarry's book. So we have division of labor. That's what I referenced with farmer alfalfa. And then he sells the produce to the grocer cat. So they're each doing different tasks. However, also in the book, he's got this example of different individuals cooperating, working together in a lumber yard. And so we have the lumberjack cutting down the tree. The branches are cut off of the tree trunk. The tree trunk is sawed into logs. And notice that there's two people here. So even for like a very particular task, there's a way to combine labor. So notice you need two people to operate that saw to go back and forth, right? So that's what Mises means by combination of labor. So we get peaceful cooperation, not just with pure specialization, but also we realize we can work together and increase our productivity in certain tasks, if it makes sense. We can work together and oftentimes using specific capital goods to increase our productivity in that task. Okay, now in my classes, the way that I introduce the division of labor is with this ham sandwich model of the economy. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but the idea is that if you consider the production of a single good, like a ham sandwich, and all of the things that were required to produce, all the steps that had to be taken to produce the ham sandwich, you start to realize that there's this vast division of labor behind it. There's a vast structure of production behind it, where there are people doing different jobs, different entrepreneurs, making different anticipations about what's going to happen in the future, what will consumer demand be for the ham sandwich or for any other of the intermediate goods in the process. And what you see is this very complex network of exchanges, which is how the Austrian economist views the market economy. Now, this is just with one good, right? One simple good. There's a similar exercise in iPencil by Leonard Reed showing all the complexity of producing a pencil. And the point is to show that this is something that we definitely take for granted. It's easy to forget the complexity of the division of labor. I think I just Googled complexity or network or something and got this image. So it's not like I actually spent the time to create this. But this is the idea. Is like our market economy is this very complex division of labor where people are specialized in doing different tasks. And it's arranged in a structure of production. So it's not just chaos for the sake of chaos. It's not like this is just some benign result of the market economy. But it is organized, it is ordered, and it's directed towards the production of consumer goods, things that consumers want. And just very quickly, the way that we can see that, if you take this network sort of thing, this web, and you organize things by time or stages of production, then you get something that looks like this, which, if you're familiar with Man, Economy, and State, especially Figure 32, that's how Rothbard depicts an early version of the stages of production or the structure of production. So this is something that applies to all of the different goods in the economy. We can think about it in this very complex way, or we can think about it in the stages of production. This is what economists have latched onto, is something that it's a heuristic or it's a diagram that we can use to talk about other things, especially if you start to calculate the spending in each stage of production. Then you can talk about the natural rate of interest and so on. Okay, but now let's answer the question, why or how is the division of labor so productive? And I have a simple example involving Crusoe and Friday. So we'll start off with Crusoe here. So suppose Crusoe can collect 2 coconuts per hour or catch half of a fish per hour. That doesn't mean that the fish falls apart when he tries to catch it. It takes 2 hours to catch one. That's what I mean there. So those are his production possibilities. If you look on the right-hand side, this is what in many economics textbooks they would refer to that as a production possibilities frontier. What are the different combinations of fish and coconuts that Crusoe can produce using his labor? And so after 8 hours, he could either have 16 coconuts, so 8 hours applied to producing coconuts, or 4 fish, right? So, and then if he divides up his time outside of those extremes, but decides to spend like half the time producing coconuts and half the time producing fish, then he would be somewhere on that boundary. So that this shows the boundary of his own production possibilities. And so in this case, if he divides his time in half, suppose that's just his preferences, he's okay with having 8 coconuts and 2 fish at the end of the day, this would be the result. Notice he's limited by his own production possibilities. There's no intent to trade at this point. Okay, and then there's this other person, Friday. Friday has the opposite production costs, the opposite labor time required to produce these 2 different goods. And so for Friday, Friday can collect half a coconut per hour or catch 2 fish per hour. And so Friday's production possibilities looks like this: either a maximum of 4 coconuts if all of the time is allocated to coconut collection, or a maximum of 16 fish if all of his time is dedicated to fish production. If he splits his time in half, we get 2 and 8. Okay, so where things get interesting is when they see each other. Maybe they see each other's production possibilities. They see how long it takes the other person to produce something. They see how many fish and coconuts they each bring to their respective huts at the end of the workday. And maybe they start to think, well, I wonder if there's, instead of us just producing what we consume, or only consuming what we produce, what if we decide to work together? What if we decide to change our production in a way that increases total production between the 2 of us? That's the idea. So they see each other's production possibilities. They have this idea that they could trade with one another, and as a result of trading, maybe, we'll see, if it works out, they'll be able to both of them consuming more coconuts and fish. And it's not something that's like immediately obvious. You've got to work through the example to see like how it happens. But this is the foundation for the greater productivity of the division of labor, and therefore civilization itself. So let's see how it might happen. Okay, so what if Crusoe goes towards coconut production and Friday goes towards fish production? So they decide to totally specialize. Crusoe only for coconuts, Friday only for fish. And what that means is Crusoe is producing 0 fish and Friday is producing 0 coconuts. So they've moved all the way to the extreme of their production possibilities. Remember, they only do this with the intent to trade. Crusoe does not want 16 coconuts. He wants some fish as well. Friday does not just want fish. Friday also wants some coconuts. So they're not doing this with the intent to consume everything that they produce. They're doing it with the intent to trade some of that so that they can get what the other person has produced. Okay, so here's what that might look like. So at the end of the 8-hour workday, Crusoe has 16 coconuts. Friday has 16 fish. Now watch the orange dots. There's going to be some moving coconuts and moving fish, but watch the orange dots. So notice when Crusoe gives, I'm going to say that he trades 7 for 7 coconuts over to Friday, there's going to be a reduction in Crusoe's coconut stockpile and an increase in Friday's stockpile. So take a close look. That's what it looks like. So just half the trade, coconuts have gone one direction. Notice that now Crusoe is well inside of his PPF, but it's not the end of the story. And Friday is well outside of his PPF, but it's not the end of the story. They still have to trade the 7 fish. And when that happens, they end up with a combination of these 2 goods. And notice, so this is the result of their trade. Their ability to consume is now well beyond their respective production possibilities. And this is the mind-blowing aspect of the division of labor. It's that it didn't seem obvious, right, that this sort of thing could happen. But they could increase total production by specializing in their comparative advantage, by specializing in the good in which they are the lowest opportunity cost producer. So you can see that with Crusoe. Crusoe, again, is on the left. He does not forego many fish by producing coconuts. You just see that by the slope of the line. So when Crusoe decides to produce 1 additional coconut, there's not that much of a decrease in fish production as a result. And likewise for Friday, When Friday decides to produce more fish, there's not much of a decrease in coconut production because they're not very good at producing those two different goods. So that's what guided them. We'll see how it works in a monetary economy. That's what guided them towards producing the thing in which they are the lowest opportunity cost producer. And that is the source of these gains from trade. But like I said, it's mind-blowing. Now, another mind-blowing aspect of the division of labor is that everyone has a spot in the division of labor. So based on the way that we set this example up, I just reversed their production trade-offs. Notice like their intercepts are opposite of each other, 16 and 2, 2 and 16, 4 and 16, 16 and 4. So I just reversed it, and so it's very obvious who should produce what, just based on the numbers as I presented them. But there's a law of economics championed by Mises. It was originally formulated, discovered by David Ricardo, called the law of association. And this, in my opinion, is the closest thing that economists have to something that could go on a Hallmark card. It's the idea that everybody has a spot in the division of labor. No matter who you are, you can be a productive member of society. So like all the other things that economists say are like reminding people of scarcity and opportunity costs. But hey, the law of association is this nice rosy thing. Put that on a card. So here's where Mises is explaining the proof of the law of association. So how could it be that somebody who is not very productive in producing all goods, and we'll restrict it to 2 goods, Mises restricts it to 2 goods, how could it be that somebody who's not very productive in producing both of those goods, could they still benefit from participating in division of labor? So Mises says if A is in such a way more efficient than B that he needs for the production of 1 unit, okay, let's simplify this. Okay, so I've simplified Mises' example for you. So there's 2 people, A and B, and they're producing P and Q. So the goods are P and Q and the people are A and B. A can produce 1 P in 3 hours. For B, it takes 5 hours. So B is the inferior producer. A can produce 1 unit of Q in 2 hours. For B, it takes 4. So notice that for both goods, it takes B longer to produce both goods. And what Mises is going to show is that even in this case, both A and B can benefit. There's a spot for B to participate in a division of labor such that they both benefit. You might think, just like with the previous example, it wasn't immediately obvious how total production could increase between Crusoe and Friday. This is even less obvious, right? It seems like A is going to be dragged down by B. A is going to have to, let's make a sacrifice if he is going to help finance some of B's consumption. Okay, so with isolation, Mises says they split 120 hours evenly between P and Q. With those production trade-offs, A can produce 20P and 30Q. B can produce 12P and 15Q. Total production, so add up both of them, is 32P and 45Q. Then they decide to participate in a division of labor. And so the way Mises has it set up is that they both totally specialize. So A only produces Q and B only produces P. Total production, after they specialize, just count up total amount of P and Q, 24P and 60Q. And then Mises does this sort of interesting thing where he refers to the substitution ratio of P and Q. It's sort of unlike Mises to do this sort of thing. And so I've got a translation, or maybe a better way to see how there are gains from trade between A and B in this case. But he says that based on this substitution ratio, so for A it's 2P to 3Q. Now what that means is for every 2P that A produces, he has to forego the production of, or he could have produced 3Q. So that's how you would read that substitution ratio. And so Mises sort of takes that as like an equivalence. It's like, oh, well, since based on the labor hours and how many I could produce, 2P is worth 3Q in terms of how long it takes me to produce these things. And then based on that, you can, re-reckon the numbers, and he says it signifies a larger output. But notice the reason why he does that is because, this points. The reason why he does that is because his outcome here is 24P and 60Q, which means that while there is an increase in Q, there's a decrease in P. right? So it's not immediately obvious as to that there has been an increase in total production, but Mises assures us because of the substitution ratios, it signifies a larger output. Okay, so here's my refinement. It's easier to see the gains from trade if you have A partially specialized in Q as opposed to totally specializing. And if you do that, using the same production trade-offs, you can get an increase in the production and consumption of both goods after they specialize. Now remember, so we don't lose the importance of this conclusion, the reason Mises is walking through this is to show that A is not dragged down by B's participation in the division of labor. B still has a spot, has a way to contribute to increasing total production, right? So that's the magnificent, wonderful conclusion of this exercise, is to show that no matter your total or your absolute productivity in making things, you still, because of the differences in trade-offs, the differences in opportunity costs and producing different things, you can still contribute to increasing total production and gaining. Everybody can gain from the division of labor. Okay, so how does it work? The law of association says that everybody has a spot in the division of labor. There's your Hallmark card quote. Even those who are less productive. Maybe leave that part out. The reason it works is because the gains from trade come from the differences in production trade-offs, not absolute productivity. So let's look at the differences in production trade-offs, and we'll use, Mises pointed out the substitution ratios, the 2P for 3Q. So I've got this down here. So B has a comparative advantage in P because for A, there's their substitution ratio, 2P to 3Q, and then so that we get 4P in the numerator for both, I'm just going to multiply it, translate it over into 4 divided by 6. So we got 4P to 6Q. This is a smaller fraction to B's substitution ratio of 4 to 5. And so what that means is that it costs A 6Q to make 4P, but for B, it only costs 5Q. And it's that difference in what's foregone, the opportunity cost of producing P, that reveals who is the comparative advantage producer in that thing. All right, so now here's the kicker. So where does the law of association come into play, or how does that work? If you flip the fractions, so turn the 2 over 3 into 3 over 2, and the 4 over 5 into 5 over 4, the inequality sign flips, meaning one person's comparative advantage in producing one good is the other person's comparative advantage in the other good, mathematically, necessarily. The only exception to this is if they have the same production trade-offs. That's the one super unlikely situation. And as we'll see, I'll mention later, that sort of situation is very unlikely because of the differences in the distribution of natural resources, capital goods, people learning skills along the way. So like the differences in skills are extended across time. They get more severe over time. As people learn things, as people make specific capital goods, as we discover land that has particular uses, it means that these differences in productivity are going to become more extreme, right? So it's very unlikely that there would be, first of all, that this would occur, that people have equal production trade-offs, but also that would extend across time. So B's comparative advantage in P is, by definition, mathematically, A's comparative advantage in Q. Okay, that's enough math. This is an Austrian conference, right? So why is this so important for Mises? Why did he emphasize the law of association so much and what it means for human civilization? He said the law of association makes us comprehend the tendencies which resulted in the progressive intensification of human cooperation. We conceive what incentive induced people not to consider themselves simply as rivals in a struggle for the appropriation of the limited supply of means of subsistence made available by nature. We realize what has impelled them and permanently impels them to consort with one another for the sake of cooperation. He says, every step forward on the way to a more developed mode of the division of labor serves the interests of all participants. Okay, so how does this work for a monetary economy? We've got Crusoe on Friday with the berries and the coconuts, A and B, P and Q. But how does this work for us in a money-using division of labor? So we don't have just two goods. We don't have just two ways to allocate our labor between two different goods. So how do we figure this out in a complex industrial market economy where there's many opportunities for us to apply our labor? So I could work here, I could work there. How do we figure out where our comparative advantage is? And that's where economic calculation comes in. So this is the other huge idea in human action. The two big ones are the division of labor and economic calculation. And it's got over 800 pages just talking about effectively these two ideas and how they're central to human civilization. Mises said that monetary calculation is the guiding star of action under the social system of division of labor. So there's something about monetary values, prices, incomes, things reckoned in money prices that guide us, right, in figuring out how to fit into the division of labor. That's what he's saying there. And the answer is, in more clear terms, is that the prospective monetary income in various employments provides an incentive to each individual to specialize in his comparative advantage. And before I give you an example, just one more quote from Mises where he's pulling together these ideas, economic calculation and the division of labor. He's going through how people criticize these ideas, and he says, other critics of economic calculation fail to realize that it is a method available only to people acting in the economic system of the division of labor in a social order based upon private ownership of the means of production. So there he's connected all of the main ideas here. We have economic calculation, the division of labor, we have also social harmony or social order as well in the form of the institution of private property. So these are all, you can't split them apart. They all work together in a way that provides for the standards of living, the civilization that we witness today. Okay, so here's our example with the employment opportunities. We have Bob, some hypothetical guy. And suppose he has three different ways that he could allocate his labor. He could be a boxer, probably fighting Paul Krugman. You see that picture. He could be an actor in a Marvel film, obviously portraying Captain America. Or he could be a singer. And without market prices, it's not obvious to Bob how he would best economize his labor time. How would he decide to allocate his labor into these three different ones, or should he specialize in one particular one? Without market prices, really the only thing that he has to go on is his own values, right? So like how much utility does he get out of these different activities? What satisfies his own preferences? So one thing that Professor Herbner said in the previous lecture is that market prices reveal to us it gives us some objective evidence about what other people want, right? So this is how entrepreneurs arrange factors of production today in anticipation of what consumers will want in the future. So it's not like they're just guessing consumers will want pencils, therefore I'm going to get the factors of production that are required to make pencils. It's more detailed than that. They need more detail than that. So how many workers should I put in this pencil factory? How many pieces of wood, raw lumber do I need to get to bring into the factory? What color paint should I put on the outside of the pencil? All these specific decisions that need to be made, and you can't just use like intuitive, gut feeling, guesswork, right? You need specific, objective facts, something to look at. And the answer is they anticipate market prices for their product. So they're thinking about how much will I be able to sell each pencil for? What total revenue will I get by producing X number of pencils? And therefore, that gives me the basis to bid specific prices for the factors of production, right? So same thing here with Bob. He has these different employment opportunities that give him different prospective monetary incomes. We'll say, I don't know, do you want this to be a month or a year? Really, the period doesn't matter. So suppose he could earn $1,000 being a boxer or $2,000 being an actor in a Marvel movie, but he could earn $5 million by being a singer. Okay, so what do these numbers mean? If these are true, if these are correct anticipations about the market expenditure on the part of consumers for the things that he's producing, either boxing events or Marvel movies or hot singles that go on the Billboard top hits, right? So like whatever he's producing, if these figures accurately represent the revenue that he would get by selling his labor services in these three different areas, it means that it's the market telling him, it's consumers telling him, we value your activity as a singer, the product of your singing labor, more than these other things. So if Bob were to choose one of these lower paying jobs, suppose he decides to be a boxer, it means that everybody else in the market, all of the potential consumers of his singing abilities, would lose out a lot. They really value, there are many consumers that value his singing abilities, would pay for concert tickets, would pay for the albums, and so on, right? So if Bob spends his time being a boxer, we all lose out on all the beautiful singing of Bob, right? So notice, like, the way I've phrased that, it's similar to the choices that Crusoe and Friday made in producing coconuts and fish. So, like, why did Crusoe decide to only produce coconuts, even though he did not want 16 coconuts? And the answer is, he was thinking about what Friday wants, right? He was anticipating Friday's gonna want some of my extra coconuts. When Friday was only producing fish, Friday was thinking, Crusoe is gonna want some of these fish. I don't wanna consume all these fish. I want a variety in my diet. So I'm willing to produce a bunch of this, but I'm expecting to be able to trade. Same thing with Bob here, and the information, the ideas, the values that are reflected in these market prices, these wages or salaries of Bob's labor in these three different tasks. So what these prices indicate is, Bob, if you become a boxer, you're not producing what everybody else wants you to produce. So if Crusoe decided not to produce a bunch of coconuts, if he decided not to specialize, then Friday's gonna lose out, and Crusoe's gonna lose out. So the prices convey that, but also they provide an incentive to do that sort of thing. So it's not like people just wake up one morning with like this, I've discovered what my comparative advantage is. Or maybe like after a bunch of work with a spreadsheet or graph paper, I figured out based on the slopes of my production possibilities frontiers, I should specialize in teaching economics. Like, no, there's none of that. What happens is the market prices for your labor do that. They provide an incentive for you to go into that line of work in which you are the comparative advantage producer. Okay, we've got a few minutes left to talk about social order. Big topic, whole libraries of books have been written about this. But we'll say a few things or see what Mises said about it. So if the social order is based on private property, it means that economic calculation is possible. And you'll see this spelled out in a later lecture by Joe Salerno, I believe, about socialism and how economic calculation is impossible under socialism. So economic calculation is the use of market prices to reckon in profits and losses. It's appraisement, which Professor Herbner mentioned in the previous lecture. And so to have market prices, you need exchange. In order for people to exchange things, you need property. So like one prerequisite for exchange to occur is people have to own the goods which they're exchanging. So without private property, there's no exchange. No exchange means no prices. No prices means no economic calculation. Without economic calculation, then you lose that guiding star that Mises talked about. You lose that ability for people to figure out what is the best way to economize my labor, what factors of production should I put together to produce what I think consumers will want. So that economic calculation is exactly what you need to do that sort of thing. Okay, so if it's based on private property, you get economic calculation. It's possible now. And the full benefits of the division of labor can be extended to all who participate. That's the law of association. If, however, your social order is based on an inhibition of private property, or if it's prohibited, that means that economic calculation is distorted or made impossible, and the benefits of the division of labor are curtailed or even eradicated in the case of full-on socialism, abolition of private property. So that's the significance of this. Without private property, we lose the ability to do economic calculation. We lose the benefits of the division of labor. Civilization crumbles. Very important. We don't want civilization to crumble. Mises talked about a civilization that crumbled. He talked about the Roman Empire. something that we all think about on a daily basis. He said, the marvelous civilization of antiquity perished because it did not adjust its moral code and its legal system to the requirements of the market economy. A social order is doomed if the actions which its normal functioning requires are rejected by the standards of morality, are declared illegal by the laws of the country, and are prosecuted as criminal by the courts and the police. So here is where Mises diagnoses what caused the Roman Empire to collapse. He said the Roman Empire crumbled to dust because it lacked the spirit of liberalism and free enterprise. The policy of interventionism and its political corollary, the Führer principle, decomposed the mighty empire as they will by necessity always disintegrate and destroy any social entity. Now, this is something that hopefully we won't witness in our lifetimes with like the countries in which we live. However, we do get little pictures of this happening. And a great picture of this happening is in the summer of 2020. People, sometimes speakers up here will refer to a year and they'll say, you guys probably weren't even born yet, but I'm sure all of you were alive during 2020. If you remember, there was a lot of social unrest, arson, vandalism, property theft. But what immediately preceded that? And of course, it was the declaration of the COVID pandemic and the response, especially the response of governments to lock down, to prevent people from going to work. And only the people who were declared essential workers were allowed to keep working, at least in the United States, right? That's how it worked. It's like only essential workers. But as we saw in the ham sandwich model, everybody's essential, right? You can't just like pluck a few people out of that and say, okay, we're just gonna let our economy run on just a few people, right? It doesn't work like that. First of all, it's too complex to do that. Second of all, it requires the cooperation of many stages of production. You can't just have one stage of production continue, even if that one is declared essential. You can't just have that one continue without other things working, other things operating in the market economy. So we had a breakdown in the division of labor instituted by government intervention, and we immediately saw collapse of culture, collapse of peaceful cooperation, right? So you see pictures of this, right? So thankfully we recovered from that somewhat. But the point is, like, whenever there's a severe curtailment of people's ability to participate in a division of labor, you're gonna witness these sorts of things that Mises is talking about. You're gonna see peaceful society go away. You're gonna see civilization go away. And in fact, the way Mises ends the whole book, and this helps prove my point that the division of labor, peaceful cooperation, economic calculation are so important for Mises in human action. The way that he ends the whole book is he basically says, if you ignore this stuff that I've been writing about, if you ignore the greater productivity of the division of labor, all of the laws of economics that I've highlighted in this book, speaking as Mises, if you ignore all of this that I've written, it's going to be bad for you, right? The society itself will crumble, civilization will crumble. He says at the very end, but if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics, they will stamp out society and the human race. So I think that we should follow Mises' advice and study economics. Thanks. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Newman. So for the questions, there'll be no personal anecdotes, nothing like that. Just ask the question, very straightforward, and no grabbing the mic. Keep it very brief. So anyone have any questions?
This goes to the first slide. Are institutions only for protecting property rights, institutions like the family or the church, or do they have some further purpose?
So the institutions that Mises was talking about is in regards to their property rights and whether they're upheld, whether business owners, entrepreneurs expect that they will be enforced. But however, Mises does talk about the family and community groups and those sorts of things, and how those are also like social organizations where people are helping each other out. Also helping to enforce certain codes of ethics, right? So that's mentioned. But for the purposes of this topic, when Mises is talking about social harmony or the harmony of interests. He's really talking about a broader social nexus that's made possible by division of labor, that's made possible by economic calculation, that's made possible by respect for property rights. Yeah.
No touch. Hi. You mentioned at the end how no private property in a society leads to the corruption of the division of labor, and then further the corruption of trade in general. Would you say in order to, obviously prevent from that corruption and keep private property intact, do you think some sort of governance is required in order to maintain that?
You're asking if I'm an anarcho-capitalist, right? Yeah, so
There's many definitions of
yes, I think that the private production of law and defense can occur, and this would be the best way for it to happen. However, Mises often wrote, and also Hazlitt wrote about the requirement for government to do the bare minimum, and for them the bare minimum was police and courts, right, to uphold private property. But yeah, I'm in the Rothbardian camp. But the reason I mentioned Mises and Hazlitt is that there's a variety of perspectives among Mises faculty. All right, thanks everyone.
All right, there'll be another break, and we'll continue at 2 p.m.
Okay, folks, if you can go ahead and come on in and take your seats, we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, I'm really excited to be here with you today. As was mentioned on Sunday night, I was once a student at Mises University. Now, that was a very long time ago. That was before we even called it Mises University. Back then it was just Mises Community College. But we've grown, we've expanded since then. I also want to echo something that Tom Woods said in his talk. I mean, as far as the experience of being out there, but now being on this side of the podium, it really is an honor, but also a responsibility. I mean, like a cameraman at a Coldplay concert, I can really impact people's lives. And I do want to make a difference in your life today by talking about entrepreneurship and how it fits in with the Austrian understanding of markets and society. In the previous lecture, Professor Newman explained how social cooperation through the division of labor provides, substantial benefits and improvements in the quality of life. This is something that was very central to Mises' understanding of the market and of society. And, when we think about social cooperation through the division of labor, we emphasize the sort of bottom-up character of coordination, right? It's not necessary that different participants in the division of labor get together and sort of explicitly agree on what they want to do. I mean, they might do that, but it's certainly not necessary that they do so. Rather, the benefits emerge kind of in a decentralized bottom-up fashion. But it turns out in the Misesian system, there's also a role, and sometimes an underappreciated role, even among Austrian scholars, of the role of certain central coordinating agents. No, of course, I don't mean state planners or university professors, I mean entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs play a very fundamental role in the Austrian understanding of the market, which is why you have a lecture on entrepreneurship, on the first full day of the conference, rather than on Friday or something, in a session on miscellaneous applied topics. I was sort of inspired to frame my discussion by an article that I read just a few weeks ago. This was published at the end of February. It's a sort of a review essay by a very prominent macroeconomist named Charles Calorimus, who was for a long time a professor at Columbia University. He's now emeritus. And he was reviewing a book by another professor named Amar Bideh on uncertainty and enterprise. And the way he opens his review, this is in the Wall Street Journal, he says, microeconomists, meaning people who study the market, right, have been trying to make sense of entrepreneurship as a distinct category of activity for more than a century. That's a fair statement. And then he says, Calorimus says, during my graduate school days at Stanford, a classmate asked Kenneth Arrow, the economist and Nobel laureate, to comment on the Austrian School of Economics' emphasis on entrepreneurship as essential to economic progress. Arrow expressed skepticism that entrepreneurship was different from other kinds of business management and did not seem to believe that it required special analysis. Okay, so I have to imagine, from Arrow's point of view, this might have been sort of a strange conversation. A student asks in a class on, I guess, microeconomic theory, mathematical microeconomic theory. As a lot of you know, Arrow was a contributor to sort of the standard general equilibrium approach, what we sometimes call the Arrow-Debreu model, named after two Nobel laureate mathematical economists. And somebody says, hey, what do you think about the Austrian school and their understanding of entrepreneurship? And I don't know exactly when this conversation took place. I can guess by when the author was in graduate school. But apparently Arrow said something like, yeah, entrepreneurs exist, but there's nothing special about what they do. It's a kind of business management, and we can study it the same way we study other kinds of business management. Now, I know that Arrow, certainly had some familiarity with the Austrian School, because when I read this, I was reminded of a very influential event in my own career history, which of course you all want to know about. Back in the early 90s, the Mises Institute helped arrange a lecture series at Stanford University, and it was named for the primary sponsor. His name was Robert Doffelmeyer. He was a great entrepreneur and a supporter of the Mises Institute. He was a member of what was then called the Institute Entrepreneurs Council. And he sponsored this series of lectures at Stanford, which was his alma mater, at which Austrian economists, Austrian scholars were invited to come in and give a talk, and then a prominent Stanford economist would give a response. And these were kind of small, it was 25, 30 people, kind of a small, intimate setting where you got to see these heavyweights kind of go at it. I remember one time George Selgin was invited to give a talk on free banking, and his discussant was Thomas Sargent, who would later become a Nobel laureate for rational expectations theory. Anyway, so they invited Murray Rothbard to give this talk, and Kenneth Arrow to give the response. And these are two very senior and highly accomplished intellectuals, both from New York City, had sort of a lot in common. They had similar backgrounds and so forth. And, I was a young graduate student myself in those days, and I thought it was great. And of course, spoiler, I thought Rothbard made the better case than Arrow. But I never forget Arrow kind of began his response by saying something like, well, I really don't know that much about the Austrian School. It's kind of like, I'm not sure who this Rothbard character is. He said, I've never really read anything by Mises. I think I might have read an article by Hayek once. And then he went on to kind of give a standard kind of mainstream mathematical critique of Rothbard's presentation, but it didn't engage at a very deep level. It was pretty superficial. And I don't believe those meetings were recorded. It would be great if they were. I'd love to watch that video again and look at the transcript. But it sort of highlighted that for someone like Arrow, it wasn't that he thought that core Austrian concepts, whether it's the praxeological method or the Austrian understanding of entrepreneurship, it's not that he thought they were fundamentally in error and needed to be refuted or attacked. He just thought they were kind of inconsequential. Like, yeah, maybe there's some truth in there, but it's already incorporated in my model, and it's not anything that's worth my time. And so clearly, even I think that must have been before the incident described in the Wall Street Journal article. Arrow never really came around to the idea that Austrian views were worth addressing. Okay, so I'll ask my question, kind of echoing the way it was described by Arrow, right? Is entrepreneurship, different from other kinds of business management? Does it require a special analysis, right? Or is it just like, I don't know, clothing sales? We could do the economics of clothing sales, or we could do the economics of, startups or something, but it's kind of not all that interesting or important. So, I'm painting with a slightly broad brush here, but I think it's fair to say that kind of in most of the mainstream texts, right, entrepreneurship is regarded as, a certain kind of labor service. Okay, so labor is, an activity performed by human actors. They're exchanging their labor services in exchange for some kind of a payment, a wage, right? And just as you could work, you could work at a car wash and then you're getting paid for washing cars, you could also work in the form of starting a company, right? Or maybe growing an existing company, managing a small business, something like that, introducing a new product. That's just another kind of labor. And you get some kind of, compensation for that, and we could call it a wage, even if, the IRS calls it something else, okay? The entrepreneurial service in this view can be analyzed just like any other factor of production. Well, we'll get into more of the technical analysis of factor markets, later in the week, but as some of you already know, the Austrian analysis of factor markets suggests that labor, like other factors, will be hired in a competitive market up to the point where the payment to the factor owner, the supplier of the service, in this case a wage, is just equal to the discounted marginal revenue product of labor in terms of how much it contributes to the employer, the buyer of labor services, how much it contributes kind of to their bottom line. Okay. I think mainstream economists would also acknowledge that, there's kind of a psychology literature or organization theory literature on entrepreneurs, which describes, entrepreneurial behavior as a kind of a personality type, the go-getter, the innovator, the more creative type, someone who has a lot of initiative, or someone who can persevere through different kind of obstacles, or someone who's very confident in their ability to bring about a desired outcome, maybe overconfident, as some of the literature suggests. In this perspective, entrepreneurship isn't, it's not harmful. It might actually contribute something to desirable outcomes, but it's really not a big deal analytically. Right? The entrepreneur doesn't play a special role. We don't need some special kind of analysis to explain the entrepreneur. We just incorporate entrepreneurship into labor economics. Well, you can sort of tell where I'm going with this. That is not the Austrian view. Right? In the Austrian view, entrepreneurship is something special. And what I find to be the most concise summary or definition is that entrepreneurship is judgmental decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Judgment under uncertainty. And I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit as we go. In this sense, entrepreneurship is a form of human action, right? The entrepreneur is an actor, but entrepreneurship is different from labor, different from the provision of labor services. It's not the same thing as management or creating businesses or being an inspirational leader. It's something unique. Okay, what is that unique thing? Well, Mises talks about entrepreneurship in both a broad sense and a more narrow sense. And so in the broad sense, entrepreneurship is action under uncertainty, or the act of bearing, dealing with the consequences of action under uncertainty. I mean, Mises says this quite plainly in Human Action. The term entrepreneur, as used by theory, by economic theory, means acting man exclusively seen from the aspect of the uncertainty inherent in every action. Okay? So human action is purposeful, right? Human beings they employ means to try to achieve objectives, but outside of some kind of abstract model like what Mises and Rothbard called the evenly rotating economy, right? Action in the real world is characterized by a lack of certainty about whether the action will bring about the desired end, right? I mean, I think of you guys, coming to a lecture like this, right? I mean, you do bear some cost of coming here, even though, like to my talk specifically, let's assume you're already on the premises. I'm not talking about your plane ticket. But there's an opportunity cost of being here. You could be taking a nap, as Professor Newman suggested you would be doing. You could be watching a Netflix video or whatever. So you do bear an opportunity cost of being here, sitting in the room right now. But presumably you chose to come to the lecture because you anticipated that the benefits you would receive would be greater than the costs that you would incur. What are the benefits? New knowledge, right? Inspiration, entertainment, just staring at a really good-looking man. I mean, that's part of it. It's a consumption benefit. Not getting yelled at by Felicia, for skipping a session. We could enumerate some of those. And you came because you expected those benefits to be greater than the opportunity cost. And, probably, almost certainly, definitely, for all of you, you'll decide later that you were right, that the benefits were vast and the opportunity cost was small. But it's theoretically possible, though highly unlikely, that you might walk out of the lecture dissatisfied. I didn't like what that guy said. I didn't understand him at all. He didn't look that good. Again, it's on paper that could happen. And then you would decide that the benefits were not worth the cost. It's like you earned a loss instead of a profit, a psychic loss or something. And you would regret your decision ex post. So when we engage in purposeful human action, we don't know for certain if we will achieve the objectives that we're aiming or striving toward. And so entrepreneurship is, we analyze entrepreneurship as that aspect of human action. How does that uncertainty impact decisions that are made? How do human actors think about managing or maybe mitigating that uncertainty? How do they respond subsequent to the results of action? How do we what are the implications of uncertainty for understanding how the world works, okay? Now, there's also kind of a narrower notion, a subset or a specialized way of thinking about acting under uncertainty. I call this entrepreneurship in the narrow sense or in the commercial sense, right? This is the act of combining and recombining productive factors, land, labor, capital, right, in pursuit of a monetary profit. Okay, so again, if you got more out of the lecture than the opportunity cost, we could say you got a psychic benefit, a psychological profit, or something like that. But no offense, but most economists are not all that interested in you, right? We're really interested in the kinds of action under uncertainty that have a big impact on our lives. The actions of specialized commercial entrepreneurs who are going out into the factor markets, the input markets. They're buying machines, they're hiring labor, they're renting land and whatever, and they're combining these productive factors to try to produce iPhones and automobiles and housing and restaurant meals and other outputs that are very important to us as sort of a society. I like the way it's described by an Austrian economist named Ludwig Lachmann, who is not as well known today, but in his book, a book he published in the 1950s on capital theory, he says, "We are living in a world of unexpected change, i.e. uncertainty, right? Hence capital combinations of capital goods used by business people will be ever changing, will be dissolved and reformed. In this activity, we find the real function of the entrepreneur." Okay, so the real function of the entrepreneur, the important function, the significant function, the function that we're really interested in at the end of the day, is this constant combining and recombining of productive factors in pursuit of monetary profit, okay? And as we'll see when we get into economic calculation tomorrow, one thing that distinguishes this form of entrepreneurship from the more general form is that the entrepreneur typically has a kind of a feedback mechanism. If the outlays, the purchasing or renting of factors is done in money, in a monetary unit, and the returns, the receipts, the revenues are also in the same monetary unit, you can compare revenues and costs, right? You can attach a cardinal number to your profit or your loss, and that may be useful to you in your decision making, right? Psychic profit, we can kind of have a loose, instinctive, intuitive understanding. But we don't have cardinal numbers to attach to it, okay? So being able to calculate monetary profit and loss turns out to be central to Mises' critique of socialism, as you'll see in Professor Salerno's talk tomorrow. Who cares? Why is this a big deal? Well, again, let me quote Ludwig von Mises. Mises says, "It is impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur from the picture of a market economy." Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. Not eliminating the entrepreneur makes the picture of the market economy a little bit worse. Okay, that's not what he says. It's like you cannot understand a market economy, an economy with private property, market exchange, prices, so-called catalactic behavior, to use a Misesian term. You cannot understand that without understanding the entrepreneur, which is why I'm pretty much the most important speaker at this whole event. Let's just get that out of the way. But look at what he says next. He says, "The various complementary factors of production cannot come together spontaneously. They need to be combined by the purposive efforts of men aiming at certain ends and motivated by the urge to improve their state of satisfaction. In eliminating the entrepreneur, one eliminates the driving force of the whole market system." Okay, so the driving force of the whole market system is this actor, this action, this function of purposefully arranging factors of production in pursuit of profit and desiring to avoid loss. Again, this is not, state planners' purposive behavior, okay? These are private actors who are engaged in voluntary exchange. But some of you might have heard kind of the market system or the division of labor described as a spontaneous order. That's a term that was popularized by Hayek. Rhetorically, there may be some force to using that language, and you can sort of understand what Hayek was trying to get at. He was saying the order that comes about from the market is not imposed by the state in a top-down fashion. That's true, but I think the term spontaneous order can be a little bit misleading or imprecise because it implies that, a Boeing 747 just sort of spontaneously appears. No, I mean, you've got human actors, you've got capitalists, you've got entrepreneurs, you've got, laborers, other suppliers of factor services who are making conscious and purposeful decisions that result in the creation of this airplane. And you've got one particular set of actors, the entrepreneurs, who really were aiming at producing an airplane. Right? Hayek's argument is sometimes, we engage in action that results in unintended consequences that the actor did not foresee, and that's certainly true. But in this case, the entrepreneurs did foresee the outcome. That was the whole point of them coordinating all these factors, because they wanted to produce, they wanted to start a particular company or produce a particular good or service. They wanted to earn a particular profit that they had in mind. It's very conscious and deliberate, private, of course, and decentralized in the sense that they can't compel other people to participate against their will. But it's not spontaneous, meaning unplanned, okay? Now, again, later in the week, we'll get into more of the details of how Austrians understand production, the production of goods and services. How do we distinguish between inputs and outputs? And I think Patrick Newman will talk about capital theory tomorrow and the different stages of production. Some of you might have seen this triangle diagram, so-called Hayekian triangle, on how the structure of production in the economy as a whole is affected by changes in interest rates and so forth. Austrians are very famous for developing a theory of what they called imputation, right? Imputation is the idea that the value of an input, like an hour's worth of labor or the use of a machine for a certain period of time, or the value of owning some tool or piece of equipment, is determined by its contribution to producing final goods and services, and then the value of those final goods and services to the consumer. It's a reversal of the Marxist idea, which he got from some of the classical economists. They made an error here. You've heard of maybe the labor theory of value, the idea that the value of goods and services to the consumer is somehow determined by the value of the factors, labor in particular, that went into their production. The Austrians pointed out that no, the causation goes the other way around. It's the value of the outputs that is imputed backwards up the supply chain to give the inputs value. If the output is not desired by consumers, it doesn't matter how much input goes into the production. Those inputs won't be desirable to entrepreneurs. They won't command a high price on the market, okay? And as was already mentioned by Jonathan Newman, all this relates to the problem of economic calculation under socialism, which I think Salerno will cover. Okay, earlier I used this word judgment. I talked about judgmental decision-making under uncertainty. There's some subtlety here because the way we use the word judgment in English and in some other languages, you said, you tell your friend, don't be so judgmental. It's like you're being bossy or you're being picky, or that's not what we mean here. Judgment, as Mises uses the term, the term is also used by Frank Knight, the American economist, famous for writing about uncertainty. Judgment is a strictly formal kind of construct, right? Judgment refers to decision-making under uncertainty. This is my definition, but it's an interpretation of what Mises says. Judgment is decision-making under uncertainty without a formal model or a decision rule. In other words, again, like your decision to come to the lecture or not, you did not have access to a mathematical model, right, where you can just plug certain things in and it tells you what to do. Yeah, of course, you can ask ChatGPT what to do. I'm not saying you can't construct some kind of a simulation, but that simulation does not ultimately compel you to attend the lecture or not. That's a decision that only you can make using your own subjective interpretation and intuition, right? In fact, other words that we use for judgment in this sense are intuition or kind of gut feeling. The Germans have a term verstehen, which is usually translated into English as understanding, but it means a kind of a deep fundamental understanding, right? So think about it this way. You say, oh, well, can't we build a mathematical model that will predict how much benefit I will get from attending Klein's talks? And essentially that's what my LLM is doing. And so the LLM is really the decision maker, so it's not judgment. But the problem is, the LLM, at least, I don't know if these haven't been invented yet, the LLM is not like a physical Terminator robot that can like grab you by the back of the neck and plunk you down in the seat as you're kicking and screaming, right? You had to choose whether or not to ask ChatGPT, and you had to choose whether or not to follow the advice given to you by ChatGPT, which, of course, as we know, LLMs make a lot of mistakes, right? There's no guarantee that you're doing the right thing when you ask AI to help you make a decision. Only a human being can make that ultimate decision about whether to move forward or not, though the human being can certainly ask computer models for help, just like you could ask another human being for advice. Okay, but it's ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to make the decision. The actor chooses to act or not to act. Listen to how Mises puts it. Mises says, the real entrepreneur is a speculator, a man eager to utilize his opinion about the future structure of the market for business operations promising profits. Again, here's the key phrase. Like Jonathan Newman, I'm going to say it, then I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit. Mises said, Mises' writing in English is very precise, but you can tell he's a native German speaker, right? That precision sometimes is hard for we moderns to follow exactly, okay? But once you analyze it, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. It's crystal clear, okay? So Mises says, this specific anticipative understanding of the conditions of the uncertain future defies any rules and systematization. It can be neither taught nor learned. The entrepreneur sees the past and the present as other people do, but he judges the future in a different way. Okay, let me break it down for you. Okay, specific anticipative understanding. That's what he means verstehen, right? This kind of, there's a tacit element to it. It's particular to the circumstances of time and place in which the actor is making the decision. It's anticipative, meaning it's forward-looking, right? It defies any rules and systematization, meaning there's not a formula. You can't just follow a little, have you ever seen those little decision trees that they use in game theory? And you can't just follow a decision tree and be told what to do, okay? It can't be broken down and reproduced in that manner. It can be neither taught nor learned. Again, what he means is, you can't like read a book on how to decide whether to attend Klein's lecture, and then you just know whether attending the lecture will bring you a net positive psychic benefit. I mean, somebody should write a book like that for sure. That'd be a topic everyone would be interested in. But such a book does not exist. And again, the entrepreneur, he sees the past and the present as other people do, but he judges the future in a different way. The entrepreneur has a unique, impossible to parameterize or mathematize fully understanding of the future that is the basis for his action. Okay, now I said earlier, we're interested in how the entrepreneur sort of operationalizes or manifests his or her judgment, and it comes in the form of ownership, right? So this actor who is the driving force of the market is not just an entrepreneur in some abstract sense, but is what Mises calls a capitalist entrepreneur. Okay, so really to understand what Mises means, we need to bring together the idea of the entrepreneur with the idea of the capitalist, which by the way would make a great book title. If only someone would write a book that has to do with this intersection of the capitalist and the entrepreneur functions. And then if only that book were available in the bookstore downstairs, and if only the author got royalties. No. So to be an entrepreneur in Mises' sense, you gotta have something on the line. you got to have skin in the game, right? So, a taxi driver who is paid a wage by the taxi company and engages with a capital asset, the taxi, that is owned by the taxi company, is an employee providing labor services. An Uber driver who owns the vehicle is legally and economically, classified as an independent contractor, right? Who is essentially an entrepreneur in Mises' sense, who pays Uber, which is a technology platform for brokering rides, brokering deals with customers, right? So if we think about the difference, the Uber driver is responsible for maintaining the value of the asset, right? The Uber driver is sort of the residual claimant on any kind of net revenues, net of costs, maintenance costs, and fuel costs, and so forth. The Uber driver bears the uncertainty associated with engaging in trying to provide rides for other people. A taxi driver who gets paid a fixed wage is not a residual claimant, right? Is not a residual decision maker, is not an owner, is an employee. Okay, I'm not saying one is a better or wiser arrangement than the other, but you have to own capital and have assets at risk, skin in the game, to be classified as an entrepreneur in Mises' sense. So again, to recap what I said on the previous slide, what the entrepreneur is doing is buying or renting capital goods, factors of production, in the present, today, and then deploying them in pursuit of profits that will only materialize in the future. Right, the revenues only come in the future. You net out your costs. You either have profit or loss left over, right? And you don't know for sure at the time of action whether your actions will yield profit or loss, okay? This is hard, right? It's not easy to do this because capital goods are diverse, meaning they're highly specific. Most capital goods are not perfectly substitutable across activities, so you might misallocate. You might have the wrong kind of car. You might have the wrong kind of machine. You might have combined factors in a way that yields a lower financial return than some other combination. And there's an almost infinite array of possible combinations of factors of production, especially capital goods, because of their heterogeneity or uniqueness, okay? I want to just dive a little bit deeper into uncertainty, because I've used the word uncertainty without really defining it exactly. So some of you may have heard of a distinction, again, that was sort of popularized by an important American economist named Frank Knight, distinction between risk and uncertainty. In fact, we often use the term Knightian uncertainty to refer to uncertainty as opposed to probabilistic risk. And what Knight had in mind is that if you think about throwing dice, like if you have a normal six-sided die, okay, when you throw the die, you do not know which number will come up, right? It could be a 1, 2, 3, all the way through a 6 if it's a normal die, okay? So yeah, so you could say, well, when I throw the die, I don't know what the future outcome is going to be, but it's a very well understood situation. It's easy to characterize the situation mathematically with like a probability distribution function, right? There are six possible outcomes. I can identify the 6 possible outcomes, and I know that each one will occur with probability 1/6. So, if I'm doing casino gambling or I have some kind of a expected utility model, here's the benefit of rolling a 3, and here's how much it costs me to roll, and the probability of it landing on a 3 is 1/6. I can multiply everything out and calculate an expected value. Okay. Knight argued that there are many situations in life, including most business decision-making situations, that are not like that, right? We can't even list all the possible future outcomes, much less assign numerical probabilities to them. So that kind of mathematical probabilistic reasoning doesn't apply in most situations of human action, certainly most business situations. So Knight used the word uncertainty to describe situations where you cannot do like what you can do with throwing dice. Okay, you don't know the range of possible outcomes, you don't know the mathematical probabilities. There are different reasons for that. Sort of mainstream economists have adopted a slightly different understanding, which mostly comes from John Maynard Keynes, surprisingly, who wrote a book on probability theory in the 1920s, around the same published in the same year as Knight's book, but much worse. And you know, in this approach, probabilities are just kind of random conjectures, and we don't try to explain what probability. You know, they're beliefs on the part of decision makers. So I can say I'm launching a company, and the probability that I'll break even by the end of the first year is, 0.26. And that just exists as an objective fact. That's my subjective belief. No, it can't be questioned, it can't be analyzed. All we can say as economists is that, Klein has this probability 0.26. That's neither rational nor irrational, that's just whatever it is. But we can say that if Klein receives some additional feedback in the future, he's supposed to adjust his belief in a certain way using what's called Bayes' rule. You may have heard of Bayes' rule or Bayes' theorem. It's a function that says how you should change a belief in response, how a rational person would update their beliefs in response to new information. So the mainstream economists believe that we don't really care what people's prior beliefs are, but we model them as updating the beliefs following Bayes' law or Bayes' rule. In finance, they have a notion they call ambiguity, which is like, it's like I know the probability distribution function, but there's like three different functions that could obtain. I don't know which one of the three obtains in reality, which is really just another way of modeling probabilistic risk. Okay. Ludwig von Mises uses a related set of concepts that he actually got from his brother. Mises had a younger brother named Richard von Mises, who was, talk about, genetics. He was a brilliant mathematician and probability theorist, professor at Harvard for many years. His best known book is Probability, Statistics, and Truth. And Richard von Mises introduced a distinction that he calls case probability and class probability. Class probability refers to situations in which we can calculate probabilities through experimentation. So he says, think about throwing the dice, right? What if you could not figure out that the probability of hitting a 3 is 1/6 just by looking at it, right? For some reason, you're an Austrian, so you're not good at math. Okay, so you have no idea. Richard von Mises says, well, what you could do is just start rolling the dice. You could just throw the die and record what number comes up each time. And you throw it once, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. You just keep throwing it and throwing it and throwing it. And if it's a normal die, right, in the limit, as the number of throws approaches infinity, the frequency with which a 3 comes up approaches 1/6, right? So probabilities are limit frequencies in situations where each event that we're interested in is one element of a class of nearly identical events. Okay, that's what it means to call something a probability. That's what it means when we say the probability is 1/6. However, according to Richard von Mises, and Ludwig embraces the same distinction, there are other situations where each event is unique and cannot be bundled together in a class of events that are similar in a meaningful way. So you don't have a frequency distribution, right? People say, oh, well, in Auburn, Alabama, if a new restaurant is introduced, 100 new restaurants have been introduced over some period, and only 10 out of the 100 were still in business a year later. Okay, so you say, well, then if I'm going to launch a restaurant, the probability of success is 1/10. Okay, but each restaurant is very different from every other restaurant. A restaurant entrepreneur who made the decision only based on that frequency tabulation would probably not be a very good entrepreneur. Every restaurant is different cuisines, different business model, different locations, different pricing. It might be useful for me to know that only 10 out of 100 of the other restaurants made it, but I presumably have some reason to believe my restaurant is more likely to make it than that, right? So I cannot use the same frequency tabulations to guide my decision-making when each event is unique. Each case is unique. And notice that there's an element of subjectivity here, right? Because it's up to a human actor or a group of human actors to determine whether case probability or class probability applies, right? Is each case of a restaurant being opened sufficiently similar to every other case of a restaurant being opened that we can put them in a class? I mean, I think most restaurateurs would say no. But you could also say each throw of the dice is not literally identical. You know, you might be gripping it tighter or more loosely. Your arm might be more extended or less extended. But most of us believe that those differences are trivial. They don't really affect what number is going to come out. So we can assume, we can act as if each element of the class is literally identical. But again, that's a question for market participants to work out, okay? If you're really interested in delving deep into uncertainty, it just so happens that there are a few recent articles, including one that was just published a couple months ago by myself and some co-authors that look at different ways uncertainty has been handled in the literature, and I certainly encourage you to download those and read them. Okay, so the reason that we care about all this, as I mentioned before, is that the skill with which the entrepreneur engages in judgment about the future is what determines whether entrepreneurs earn profits or losses. Okay, so in a kind of a long-run equilibrium state, the so-called evenly rotating economy, every factor is paid its discounted marginal revenue product to the penny. Owners of firms earn some kind of return, an implicit wage for sacrificing immediate consumption, deferring their own payment until the future when revenues are received from consumers. Capitalists earn some interest, implicitly or explicitly based on time preference. But that's it, there's nothing left. There's no residual, there's no leftover profit or loss. Outside the evenly rotating economy, i.e. in the real world, right, some entrepreneurs are better than other entrepreneurs in anticipating future market conditions, in figuring out, in making a good intuitive judgment about what consumers will buy and how much consumers will be willing to pay and what competitors might do and so forth. Okay, so entrepreneurs are competing with each other for factors based on their knowledge and beliefs about the present, technology, capabilities, resources, and so forth, and more importantly, their beliefs about the future. So, in other words, the actual marginal revenue product of a factor is not given at the time that factor purchase or rental is made. It's a guess about what, because revenues only come in the future. So the marginal revenue products or the discounted marginal revenue products only come into existence in the future after action has been undertaken. They're just estimated at the time of action. So those who are more skilled at estimating these marginal revenue products will tend to be more successful in entrepreneurship than those who are less capable, and that's where we get profit. That's what underlies profits and losses. And of course, in a market economy, you have competition among entrepreneurs. Those who are better at entrepreneurship will earn profits, they'll accumulate more profits, they'll be able to reinvest, expand their businesses, and so forth. Those who earn losses will eventually be selected out of the market. So the competitive market process gives us a tendency for more entrepreneurial activity to be in the hands of the more capable entrepreneurs. Mises says this in his short book, Profit and Loss. If entrepreneurs fail to produce in the cheapest and best possible way those commodities which consumers are asking for most urgently, they suffer losses and are finally eliminated from their entrepreneurial position. Other men who know better how to serve the consumers replace them. So the market process for Mises is this process of selection among entrepreneurs, the process of putting different entrepreneurial judgments to the test and seeing which entrepreneurs are more skilled at engaging in judgment, in doing it well. It's not the same thing as the convergence towards equilibrium within a given market, which is what the term market process is sometimes taken to mean, even within the Austrian School. Rothbard makes the same point using slightly different language. The profit maker is allocating factors where they had been undervalued as compared to the consumer's desires. The greater a man's profit has been, the more praiseworthy his role, For then the greater is the maladjustment that he alone has uncovered and is combating. The greater a man's losses, the more blameworthy he is, for the greater has been his contribution to maladjustment. In other words, when you hear, your Marxist friends, talk about how evil profits are, and no, the profit system, which you should always correct your Marxist friend, a more accurate term is the profit and loss system. They usually act as if profits are just sort of automatic, right? The profit and loss system is the way of assuring that society's resources are being allocated in the most efficacious ways. Rothbard goes further with characteristically Rothbardian prose, where he calls this person the bumbling loser. We should not be too hard on the bumbling loser. He receives his penalty in the form of losses. Anyway, you can go, the vision of the bumbling loser is one of my favorites. Okay, so in summary, right, entrepreneurship is best understood as judgmental decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, and in the more specific sense, this buying and selling, renting, and ceasing to rent factors of production and combining them in the attempt to produce goods and services that consumers will want to buy, okay? Without that entrepreneurial function, we don't have companies, we don't have networks of producers and so forth that give us the goods and services that we require. So entrepreneurship is not just a specialized add-on to the study of economics. It's not the economics of small business or something like that. Entrepreneurship is the driving force, in Mises' words, of the market economy, and thus something that we all need to study and appreciate very carefully. Thank you. Okay, so 15-minute break, and then we'll reassemble at 3.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. You had Klein, now we're going to recline. So I have lots of these every time we have a party. Say, please do not decline our invitation. My friends still love it. It never gets tired. Okay, so I'm very excited to be back at Mises University. Best week of the year, of course, and it's just so great to be back with you all and with colleagues. It feels like coming home. And it's an exciting time to get to talk to you about money. A lot to talk about where it comes from, what it is, and why it's essential for a thriving economy. And it's been, there's been some more serious talk recently that we should all be excited about abolishing central banks. So Milei, of course, ran on that, a campaign on that promise. He seems to be sadly walking back on that now. But I was kind of excited. Didn't get a lot of press, but here in the U.S., there's been some pushback on the renovation of the D.C. Federal Reserve building. They spent $2.5 billion with a B on renovating it, and some people have said they're trying to turn it into another Palace of Versailles. And when they confronted Powell about it, his response was, the cost overruns are what they are. So anyway, I was hoping that would get a little bit more traction in the news. But also recently, there was a Forbes headline that said, the signs are there. The gold standard is coming back. So we can hope. So anyway, there's a lot going on, a lot to discuss beyond just what I'm going to include in this lecture today. Of course, money has always been an essential part of Austrian economics, and we'll go through some of the reasons why today. Looking back through some of the history of the Austrian School, we see some of the greatest contributions were actually in money and monetary theory. Menger and Mises and Rothbard and others in their tradition, many of them, some of them here this week have developed not only just the origin of money, but also explain money's essential functions and what makes money sound or unsound. Without the contributions of the Austrian School, we might still have the state theory of money, that money is whatever the state says it is, and that the currency has its value just because of the sovereign's decree. So we're going to give money the proper respect it's due and talk about money on our first full day of Mises U. So let's start off with who needs money. Jonathan Newman did a great introduction for me on Robinson Crusoe when he's stranded alone on the island, and everything that he consumes is what he produced. He had no reason to produce anything beyond what he was going to consume. So he had zero need for money, right? There's no store where he could go spend the money. He can't eat it. He doesn't, build a tent out of money. And so when Robinson Crusoe is alone on the island, then money serves no purpose. Okay, so then later in the story, when he discovers Friday somewhere on the island, where has he been all this time? He meets Friday on the island, and still, even when there's just Robinson Crusoe and Friday, just the two of them, there is really no need for money. They can trade their fish and coconuts just based on subjective values, and they don't need money even then. So it doesn't become necessary until the society expands beyond just a few families. Then the stage is set for the emergence of money. So also remember from Dr. Newman's lecture that voluntary exchange occurs because both people expect to benefit, to be better off, and because of this external fact of their differences and their aptitudes and their abilities to produce, and also differences just in the locations where we are. Some land is more arable than other lands, and so just from those external facts, then we see the benefits of exchanging. And so with specialization and exchange, through the division of labor, we each develop our best skill according to comparative advantage. and each region develops its own particular resources. And we found that through that, we found that each of us is better off if we each specialize producing a limited number of goods, and then we rely on exchange for most of what we consume. We produce a lot of something, even though we don't necessarily want or need to consume it ourselves. We produce it for exchange, and we find out that as opposed to being self-sufficient, producing everything that as opposed to producing everything we're going to consume, we find that we are better off doing this, specializing, and then getting most of what we have through exchange. We nearly starve when we are self-sufficient. So we can enjoy higher standards of living, get more coconuts and more fish. But if we are exchanging without money, if we're exchanging and doing barter that is goods for goods, that is going to have us no better off or not very much better off than remaining self-sufficient. Okay, so barter has two basic problems we're going to discuss. First, the problem of indivisibilities of some goods, and second, a double coincidence of wants requirement. So last month, we traveled to Switzerland with some friends to celebrate our darling daughter's graduation, she's here this week. So here we are in Switzerland with some friends, and I want to tell you, it really is as spectacular and beautiful as you've heard. Switzerland is really beautiful, views of lakes, mountains, it's amazing. So in preparation for the trip, when we were planning to go, I did some research and I found a company online called Grindelwald First in Switzerland. What Grindelwald First does is they offer gondola rides up the mountains. Of course, I wanted to do that, but what I was really interested in is I wanted to ride mountain carts down the mountain. So they basically give you an adult-sized tricycle and you ride down the mountain, and it's very steep, a very steep mountain. And when you're riding down the mountain on this tricycle, you ride the brakes the entire time. So, because if you ever let go, I mean, it was frightening. So it's very dangerous. And so, of course, we had to wear some dorky looking helmets. So there you go for the meme machine. Or dorky looking helmet. So, well, we found out while we were in Switzerland that almost everything is really expensive there. So let's imagine buying our tickets for mountain karting down the side from, where we rode the gondola up to Grindelwald. Let's imagine buying those tickets under conditions of barter. So, little known fact about me, you probably never heard this, but in my spare time, I really enjoy gardening, not the vegetable kind, but flowers. Specifically, I really love designing flower beds. And I shouldn't say this, but Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're as good at it as I am. I know, so I'm embarrassed to say that, but our landscaper, it was good enough that our landscaper jokingly, but I'm still taking it as a badge of honor, jokingly offered me a job. So I would have turned it down anyway. But see for yourself, I couldn't pick just one picture. I had to do a collage of different flowers. And I have learned from Marty Rockwell, who you may have noticed the Grounds Institute are beautiful. And I've learned from a little bit from Marty, not anywhere near as close to Marty's skills. But anyway, there's a collage of my flowers. And I wanted to say, here I am out here. And because I'm an old Southern woman, I have to wear a funny hat. I don't make the rules. So anyway, a lot of my friends have asked me, Sandy, will you come help me lay out and design my flower beds for me? So I am quite in demand for my gardening. So naturally, when I am bartering, I bring a lot to the table. I bring a lot of value in my flower beds. However, as great and as beautiful as my flower beds are, what if the mountain karting tickets are even more valuable? What if they're twice as valuable as my garden designs? then what would Grindelwald first do? Could they just give me a ride halfway down the mountain? That solution seems to create its own set of problems. Could they put me on half of a trike, half of a mountain cart? I don't know which half I would want, the front or the back, left or the right. Which half would I want of this mountain cart? So you can see this would be a problem, that trading goods that are not easily divisible, that presents a hindrance to trade under conditions of barter. Also, even if the goods are divisible, even if it's, a loaf of bread that you can cut in half or fourths or eighths, even when goods are divisible into smaller units, it's very difficult for two exchangers to find each other, because in barter, what's called a double coincidence of wants is required for exchange to take place. That is, I have to have what you want, and you have to want what I have. Okay, so for example, if I have some really beautiful daylilies and rose bushes to trade, and the people at Grindelwald First have a mountain cart that's available for rent, how are we going to get together if they're not interested in my garden design? What they really want, say they'll rent me a mountain cart, ride down the mountain, but what they really want is a chainsaw. So if we don't have what each other wants, then this trade's not going to take place. So for the survival of my economic professor colleagues who specialize, their division of labor, they have specialized in producing economics lectures and economics articles. I'm so glad we don't live under conditions of barter any longer, because think of us trying to eke out a meager existence and finding food and shelter with only our economics lectures to trade. In fact, y'all, I can't believe I was able to get this, y'all, but I have an actual photo. I got this actual photo of some of our Mises U faculty when they were once living under conditions of barter, and there they are. So thank God we have money now. Okay, so one more problem of barter is, because every good trades against every other good, each good has to have a whole array of prices, right? A bottle of Sprite has to be priced in terms of every other soft drink, right? It has to be priced in terms of every gardening tool, in terms of every possible mountain cart ride, and every other good. And so if we had an economy of only 1,000 goods, there would be almost 500,000 prices. Okay, so just so you have a sense of what 1,000 goods looks like for scale, looked up how many goods a typical Circle K convenience store. You'll find these in Auburn. You may see me in there going in to get my favorite Topo Chico. The typical Circle K store has between 500 and 600 unique goods that have an SKU, that have their own unique barcode. So they typically carry between 500 and 600, but a store like Kroger, another grocery store that you'll find here in Auburn, has between 40 and 50,000 items. So think of the staggering number of prices we would have to have of each good denominated in every other good. So imagine the chaos. Mises said that as the division of labor expands more and more, that is, as we're enjoying more and more the production of a wider variety of goods, then money becomes more necessary. So it's clear that any sort of developed economy is going to be impossible under direct exchange or barter. So how does money come about? Under indirect exchange, that is trading goods for money and then your money for other goods. You sell your product, what you have produced, not for a good that you need directly, not for the good that you want, but you trade it for another good that you can then in turn take and go get a good that you do want, that you do desire. And at first, adding this extra step seems very clunky, and this is just more complicated. But the truth is, it really simplifies and makes the whole process less complicated. If we think about under barter, and you're bringing goods to market to exchange for other goods, you can think of the goods as having their own degree of saleability, their ability to be sold, right? And some goods are going to be more saleable and some goods are going to be less saleable. The more saleable a good is, the more easily its owner could exchange it for other goods at a price. Right? Somebody selling bread has an advantage over me selling a fertilizer for my roses, right? So I've got this great rose fertilizer. It works really great. It really increased the number of blooms on the rose bush. I can convince you of its merits, but it's still not as saleable as bread. There just aren't as many people who want rose fertilizer. So I'm going to have a more difficult time with my rose fertilizer finding trading partners. Of course, it's not impossible because I could always be willing to accept a lower price for my fertilizer, but it's clearly less saleable than bread. So owners of less saleable goods will exchange their goods not only for those goods they want and wish to consume, but also for goods that they do not directly value, but they will still accept them in exchange so long as they're more saleable than the goods that they give up, right? As long as I don't necessarily want blueberries, but if blueberries are more saleable than my rose fertilizer, I'd be willing to accept those because more people will accept my blueberries. So over time, Minger argued the most saleable goods were desired by more and more traders because of that advantage in exchange. So then the demand for this very saleable good, their most saleable good, changes, and people don't demand it just then for use and consumption, but also for use and exchange. So the demand for this most saleable good takes on this extra component to where now this good is acting as a medium of exchange. The choice of a good or goods as a medium of exchange is a gradual, self-reinforcing process. As more people accept it, then the commodity itself becomes more acceptable and even more marketable. We don't know how long this process takes, but I heard Bob Murphy explaining we wouldn't expect it to be a long, drawn-out process. He said, I can imagine it happening rather quickly once people recognize their obvious advantage of doing so. So what makes a good more likely to be, what makes a good more likely to become a medium of exchange? Goods that are easily divisible into smaller units, goods that are durable over a long period of times. We're changing hands. This good is changing hands a lot, and it's not breaking down. If it's easily transportable, if we can have a small weight of it with a high value, that makes it more desirable. Also, if it's fungible, where one unit of this good is just as good as any other unit, right? It's not like your jacket that you take to the dry cleaners, where you go and you want to pick up your jacket. That would not be a fungible good, but one where any jacket would do. So one unit is just as good as any other. Eventually, one or two of the commodities are used and they become generally accepted. That is, accepted in the overwhelming majority of exchanges, and then it is called money. So historically, what has served as money? We have lots of examples throughout history. Jonathan Newman will be glad to know I got this picture actually from a children's book that we have by DK. Bread, wheat, shells, nails. But through the centuries, two commodities, gold and silver, have displaced other commodities as a generally accepted medium of exchange. So this has been the one. And I didn't mention, it was on the slide, but I didn't say scarce. If somebody figures out some trick to producing gold in their basement so that gold became less scarce, then it's possible the market might choose some other commodity as the medium of exchange. Carl Menger pointed out origin of money, said it's not necessary or even conceivable for money to be established by some authoritarian decree or by explicit contract among the citizens. Instead, the more plausible explanation is that money originated spontaneously because of the immediate and obvious benefit of using a more marketable good as a medium of exchange. And that benefit was recognized by the parties involved. So it's hard to imagine anybody conceiving of a money without actually experience it. Like there's no, it's not likely that there was a king who came up with this idea. So Menger said, hence it's also clear that nothing may have been so favorable to the genesis of a medium of exchange as the acceptance on the part of the most discerning and capable economic subjects for their own economic gain and over a considerable period of time of eminently saleable goods in preference to all others. So money is unlikely to have originated in any other way, as if what we said before wasn't enough, but Mises added to it. He said, it's unlikely to have originated any other way outside of this barter to money process, because embedded in the demand for money is the knowledge that we have of the barter prices for these goods in the immediate past. Right, so we knew what this good traded for yesterday, and so already have an idea of what to accept or expect to be able to get for this today. So unlike consumption goods, money must have these pre-existing prices on which to ground a demand for it. How will we know how much money we need if the sovereign decree just said, these little pieces of paper are now money, right? So money must have pre-existing prices for us to be able to ground our demand for it. So Mises' regression theorem explains that can only happen by beginning with a subjectively valued useful commodity under barter, and then adding the demand for the medium of exchange to it, to the previous demand just for direct use for the good. David Graeber in 2011, he made the case, or he made the argument in his book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. He claims that money did not have to originate out of barter. He says there's no evidence of the existence of any barter economy, which I don't find surprising given the problems that we've just gone through with barter. People were so busy trying to overcome indivisibilities and double coincident ones, how do they have time to write down a record of this? So anyway, and also fairly quickly, people would recognize the advantages of having a medium of exchange. So using the logic of action, Menger and Mises offered an explanation of how commodity money must have emerged out of barter, even if we don't have the historical record of it happening. So how do we go from gold and silver coins as money, and now we have rectangular pieces of paper that fit into our rectangular wallets? Well, paper does not have a lot of value in exchange, right? People don't want to give up their goods that they worked hard to produce for just a little piece of paper, right? So paper doesn't have a lot of value in exchange. So going from gold coins to paper, it really started because gold is heavier than paper, right? People found it difficult to haul and dangerous to haul their heavy gold coins around, and so they were storing them in secure warehouses, and the secure warehouse issued a receipt or a paper claim for the units of gold that were being stored there. And then to make purchases, sometimes instead of going to the warehouse to get the gold coins and then going to the market to buy the goods, Instead, they simplified it and they just said, let me sign over, here's my receipt, this claim to these amounts of gold, and you'll trade the goods to me for that. So eventually, the paper claims, enough people found that the claims could be reliably cashed in for gold. And so then the paper claims started circulating as a medium of exchange. So once we have money, what are the benefits of having money? We talked about how barter is so problematic. Well, the benefits of money, all the problems of, one of them is just that the problems of barter are gone, right? There's a reduction in prices. Now every good is priced in one unit, right? It's priced in our money unit, whatever that may be. So whatever it's called. So we've already seen that without money, there could not be any specialization because these difficulties of overcoming the double consequences of wants requirement, finding our trading partners. So there would not be a very extensive division of labor, right? And there would not be specialization, so the economy would not advance beyond really a bare primitive level. But with money, we can have elaborate structure of production, right? That can now be formed with land, labor, and capital, receiving payment at each stage of production in this money terms, right? And so only with the establishment of money, only once we have money can we have rational economic calculation. Now people can say, they're not calculating in terms of coconut and fish or rose fertilizer and bread. Right now we can do our calculation in one unit money. I spent $20 on this. I sold it for $25, right? Now we can calculate and know and compare values easily. So, that's my next point, is that it's easy to compare the values of one good to the value of any other good. So if the dollar price of gold now is up around $3,300 an ounce. So a zero-turn lawnmower, I kind of want one of those, even though we hire somebody to cut our grass, but I think every now and then I might want to go out there with my zero-turn lawnmower. But anyway, that costs around 1 ounce of gold, okay? I found online what else would trade for that. A low mileage Mercedes C-Class costs around 12 ounces of gold. You can go down the road to Montgomery. There's a 2024 with 10,000 miles Mercedes. If you're, Peter, you didn't hear that part. You can go down the road and get a Mercedes. But everybody can see then that a Mercedes then would buy 12 of these zero-turn lawnmowers. So it makes it easy when we have money. Everything's denominated in the same unit, so these comparisons can be made more easily. So most physical goods are sold in terms of their weight, tons, pounds, ounces, grams, etc. And the size of the unit that's chosen when we are selling different commodities, the size of the unit doesn't matter, makes no difference, because all units of weight are convertible into each other, right? So 1 pound is 16 ounces, 1 ounce is 28.35 grams. So if gold is a chosen commodity, then the size of the unit we use for the currency does not matter. It makes no difference. So I can sell I can sell something for 1 ounce in the US, or I can sell it for 28.35 grams in France. These are the same price. So this all seems obvious, and you think, gosh, why is she even mentioning this? This all seems obvious, but people forget this simple truth. Because of that, there's a lot of confusion, and because people think of money as some abstract units of something. And even when we're on the gold standard, people thought in terms like this: well, the American money's dollars, French money's francs, German money is marks, right, et cetera. So really, those were all tied to gold. Those were all tied to gold, and because they were considered sovereign and independent monies, and because people were thinking of the names of the money and not in units of gold, it was easier then for countries to go off the gold standard, right? So before government fiat money, the various names given, like dollars and francs and marks, those were all just names given for a weight of gold. Before 1933, people would say that the price of gold was, quote, fixed at $20 an ounce. Sure, but that's a little bit misleading. The correct way of looking at it would be to say the dollar was the name given for 1/20th of an ounce of gold. If you have 1/20th of an ounce of gold, we're calling that dollar. Okay, but people miss that connection. And because of that misunderstanding of the monies being named definitions for units of weight, it was misleading to talk about exchange rates for one country's currency in terms of another. But it's really pretty simple. The pound sterling, for example, did not really exchange for $5. The dollar was at the time defined as 1/20th of a gold ounce, and the pound sterling was at the time the name for 1/4 of an ounce of gold. So really 1/4, remember, is what 5/20ths reduces to. Those were the same prices. So what about the specific value of money? What is the price of money? When I take my money to the market, what is the money worth? Well, let's start with something let's start with something other than money. What about my hedge trimmer? If I take my hedge trimmer to the market and I want to trade that, what could I get in the market for my hedge trimmer? Say I could get $100 for my hedge trimmer in the market. Then the purchasing power of my hedge trimmer in terms of money is $100. So you could say that your $1 buys 1/100th of my hedge trimmer, right? It's the same thing with money. So if I sell this money, what can I get in exchange? If I have money and I'm going to sell it in the market for goods, what can I get in exchange? Well, my hedge trimmer, that only traded against money, right? So I had one price, $100 for my hedge trimmer. But money trades against everything else, right? Money trades against all other goods. So we need to list all the possibilities for what the money trades for. So $1 trades for 1/100th of a hedge trimmer. $1 trades for, in some cities, 1/50th of a steak dinner. It trades for 250,000th of a 2-bedroom condo in Auburn, just down the road from the Institute, if you're looking to move here to be closer to the Mises Institute. So then what's the purchasing power of money? Purchasing power of money turns out to be a whole array of quantities of other goods and services that it commands in exchange. So the purchasing power of the dollar is the inverse or the reciprocal of the overall price level, which, by the way, it's probably already been mentioned, and it will be mentioned again, that the price level is specialized and unique to you based on the basket of goods that you buy. But in general, just for our purposes here, keeping it simple, we'll say this general price level, the inverse of that is going to be what your purchasing power of the dollar is. So if we had a doubling of all prices, if all prices doubled, then the purchasing power of money is cut in half, right? And so if my hedge trimmer is now $200, then your $1 used to buy 1/100th of my hedge trimmer, now it buys 1/200th of my hedge trimmer. So purchasing power of money can be thought of as a price of money, where that price or the value is really determined like any other price in supply and demand, right? So just like with supply and demand, if we have an increase in the supply of a good, then the value of that good in exchange tends to fall. If there's a decrease in supply of that good, then this good is now relatively more scarce. Its value in exchange rises. It's the same thing with money. There's more an increase in value of money, then its value in exchange falls. If there's a decrease in supply of money, then its value in exchange rises. Similarly with demand, if the demand for money, which here we're not talking about how much money would you like to receive as a gift, right? Demand for money, Rothbard explains the way we use it is the amount of money you wish to hold in cash balances. If there's increased demand for money, its value in exchange rises. There's decrease in demand for money, then its value in exchange falls. So what is the optimal supply of money? A lot of times we hear the Federal Reserve is tinkering with the money supply. They're either loosening it or they're tightening it or easing it, I should say. So what should the money supply be? Is there an optimal amount? Is there the exact right amount for today? And does that change tomorrow? Right? So Rothbard points out that this was really a silly question. Nobody ever asked, what's the optimal supply of pizzas, or what's the optimal number of movie theaters for us to have? An increase in consumer goods and producer goods, like, for example, pizza or movie theaters, those tend to be something that's used up and worn out. And having more of those goods, those make us better off because more of our wants are satisfied in the process, right? Money's different. As a medium of exchange, money is not used up. It's not destroyed, but it's transferred from one cash balance to another cash balance. So that's why the amount of money, the optimal supply of money, just doesn't exist. So any amount of money is just as good as any other in performing this function of medium of exchange. So the purchasing power of money, or the price of money, is just something that adjusts to permit all the exchanges that all people want to make. The purchasing power of money will adjust up or down so that a money supply of $20 billion is just as good as a money supply of $200 billion. It's just with the smaller money supply, the price level will be lower. Larger money supply, the price level will be higher. So we can see the effects, what happens when we increase the money supply through the Angel Gabriel model. And in this model, we have this benevolent but economically ignorant angel wants to benefit mankind and descends to earth one night and doubles everybody's cash balances while they sleep. So when they wake up the next morning, everybody discovers we have double the cash balances that we did yesterday, and so people rush out to buy at the prevailing price level. And when this excess demand for these goods, bids up the price of those goods, then we see that we got double the cash balances. We also have double the prices, and so society is no better off. Right? There was no additional human wants satisfied because the supplies of all consumer goods and productive resources, those have not changed. There's no new technology. It was just a doubling of the cash balances. So no additional needs have been met. So the real money supply, or that is what the money can buy, has remained unchanged because cash balances doubled, but also the price level doubled. So the purchasing power has been cut in half. But let's take a little bit more, let's look a little bit more closely at what the angel Gabriel did. We'll see that some people were actually benefited in this at the expense of some other people, even though everybody received the same doubling of their cash balances. So the early birds who woke early and they discovered this, that their money, that their cash balance was much higher. Let's say the early birds, they rushed out, they immediately went and bought goods. They spent all their money before the prices had risen. Okay, those who slept late or waited a few days or weeks to think over, how do I want to spend this extra money that I have? They find that when they go out to buy, then they're buying after the prices have risen and their cash balances have decreased in purchasing power. So they find they cannot purchase more at all with this with this new money. So the increase in money supply did not benefit society as a whole, but it definitely was a benefit of the early spenders at the expense of the late spenders. So we really see a transfer of wealth in that process. So since every money supply is equally optimal and a larger money supply is no more beneficial than a smaller money supply, nobody, including economists, needs to be concerned with that of what the optimal money supply is. So under the gold standard, the one and only way to increase the money supply would be to dig more gold out of the ground. And doing that, mining, is a costly activity. It requires scarce resources to get that job done. And so the money supply under gold standard will really be determined by the profitability of mining, which of course is determined by or affected by the costs of mining, right? And so if the costs rise or fall, we would see the predictable result of changing the amount of mining, the amount of gold that's dug out of the ground. So one factor that affects the cost of gold production is, of course, the price level. Right, so as the price level rises, the prices of those resources that are used in the mining of gold, the prices of those also increase, and gold production would decline, and the opposite occurs when the price level falls. So we should point out that an increase in a commodity money like gold or silver does benefit society, because part of the increase in the gold always goes some to consumption, industrial uses, jewelry, electronics, etc. So you can get gold either by mining it, or you could get it fraudulently by counterfeiting it. So I want us to look at the effects of counterfeiting so we can better understand just this whole process of inflation. Let's say that some bad guys, none of y'all, of course, but let's say some bad guys get together and they are going to mint some counterfeit gold coins in their basement. And these coins are not gold, they're actually made of brass. And when they go out and spend their brass coins, they're undetected, right, when they go and spend them in the market. And so they spend these fake gold coins, and that has the effect of increasing the money supply and increasing demand for goods. Well, when the demand for goods increases, that increases the price level of those goods, and that decreases the purchasing power of money for everybody else, right? So just like in the Angel Gabriel model, except for there's one crucial distinction. This new fake money enters at a specific point in the economy. So where the bad guys, where the counterfeiters spent their money, that's where the money is injected first, and that's where those prices rise. And so the counterfeiting is really, what it's doing is it's enriching the counterfeiters, the bad guys, and those they bought from at the expense of the people who get it late in the process as the money spreads through the economy, or they get it not at all for people who are on fixed incomes. So the demand for goods bought by the bad guys, that increases first, increasing those prices, and then it spreads out until eventually all prices in the economy are affected. So the counterfeiters and those they buy from, they got to spend the money early in the process, like the early birds in the Angel Gabriel model, and they benefit. While if we think about the widows and the people on fixed incomes, they're worse off now with the same income but at a higher price level. So counterfeiting is really a subtle method of fraudulently gaining at the expense of the rest of society through this inflation process. So it's a transfer of wealth from those who spend it later, not at all, to those who get the money first. So my first Mises U, I heard this money lecture from Tom Wood said last night, the opening night lecture he heard from Murray Rothbard. Same for me, but my money lecture was from Hans Hoppe. And so I can't take credit for this. I'm going to give credit where credit's due to Hans Hoppe. He said, we would not expect money to be paper because paper money, as we said before, does not have much value in exchange. People are not willing to part with their goods that they worked hard to produce for little pieces of paper. We would not expect them to be money to be national, because now we're back to this double coincidence of wants at the border. I have dollars and I want the French goods, but you don't want dollars, right? And so, and then also, we would not expect it to be under the control of any entity, because any supply of money will adjust in the price level so that anyone is able to conduct all the transactions. So why do we have exactly that? Why do we have a national paper money under the control of a central bank? Why do we have that? Well, the reason why is because as we saw the counterfeiters issuing currency transfers wealth to the one who issues it, right? The issuer is enriched. So a monopoly in the provision of money, which is what we have with the state, with the central bank, that's the most really desirable tool that a state can have. So you're going to hear more about that this week. So thank you very much. And now, 15-minute bathroom and drink break. See you back for Howden next.
Hey guys, could you go ahead and take your seats, please, because we're almost ready for our next talk. It really does work. Yeah, wow, I do have a booming voice. Okay. I am not David Howden, by the way, but before Professor Howden takes the stage, I want to pass along a couple of announcements from our wonderful staff. First, at the conclusion of Dr. Howden's lecture, please make your way downstairs to, are we doing it outside or inside? Does anybody know? Okay, make your way downstairs to where everybody else is going for the group photo, okay? And the second announcement is, don't forget tomorrow at the end of the day's lectures, the buses are gonna take us directly to the pool party. So be sure and bring your swimsuit with you tomorrow morning. You won't have a chance to go back to your room and get it before the party. Okay, so I'm not gonna give you a generous introduction because I didn't get one. I mean, you have to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Klein, for that generous introduction. I thought he was joking. And I'm well aware that the only thing standing between all of us and dinner is me, and that's probably more important to me than it is to you. So hopefully 45 minutes will be it, okay, guys? The lecture is on banking, and I don't know if you've given this any thought, but it's a little bit strange because if you're a student in an economics curriculum at a university, one standard course is money and banking, and there's no other course which is devoted to an industry. Like there's no class on the car industry, or there's no class on the furniture industry, but there's a class on banking. And I don't know to what extent students really think about how strange this is that we've got one industry that gets a full semester treatment. So my job in this 45-minute lecture is to give a good overview for what's strange about banking and the elements that make it strange and why it really matters. And to complicate things, we use one term, banking, to describe two different processes. So on the one hand, we like to discuss central banks and central banking. And then on the other hand, we have private banking or commercial banking, like banking as you would know it, where you go to make your deposits. And there's some confusion as to what the relationship is between these two banking systems. So I want to clarify that. Now, when we talk about banking, we're really talking about, at least in the modern world, two things that are happening at the same time. Most of you, when you think about your bank, consider it in the context of doing one of two things. So you'll go to your bank at some point in your life to make a deposit, to put currency in it, and then receive a piece of paper or an electronic statement that says you have money with it. And you will also go, probably at some point in your life, to go to your bank to take out a loan, likely a mortgage or a car loan, and some of you might have student loans that are offered through your banks. And these two types of activities, when they're done separately of one another, there isn't really any problem, but when we mix them together, they create a process that has an impact on the money supply. And that impact on the money supply has some challenges. So on the one hand, there's some legal problems with mixing together these two types of banking processes, deposit taking and loan issuance. And on the other hand, we create a process or an impact on the money supply that breeds economic instability. And this is more the question of a later lecture on Austrian business cycle theory, but I want to give you a good preview in preparation for that of how the impact on the money supply actually happens. So Dr. Klein just gave you a lecture on money. And one of the conclusions that you can take away from that is that money is the generally accepted medium of exchange. It's what we use to settle the payment of goods and services that we buy. Now, implicit in that definition of money as the generally accepted medium of exchange is that money has to embody two things at the same time. The first thing is that it sells at par value. And par value is a quality whereby if you go to buy a shirt and the price tag says it's $10, you only have to give $10, like 10 singles or one $10 note or whatever combination reaches $10. That's all you have to give. That's a little bit different than if you went to buy a shirt that was priced at $10 and you said, well, I want to sell shares of a company that I own, and it depends on the market price at that moment in time, how many shares I have to sell. That would be a market value. So money trades at what's called par value, where the value of it is already predefined. And at the same time, you can access that value that money has on demand at a moment's notice without having to wait for it. And this is a little bit different than a financial asset like a bond or credit instrument, for example, where you have to wait a period of time before you can get the value that it has. So a bond might mature in 10 years in the future, and you have to wait 10 years in order to get that value back. That's not like money, because money, you can get the value at a moment's notice on demand. Now, if you think about those two criteria as being essential for what money embodies as a medium of exchange, the next question is, well, how do we define the money supply? If somebody asked you to go out there and start counting up all the items that you think qualify as money, what would you actually consider to be money? And the answer to that question is anything that sells at par value, doesn't have a fluctuating price, and also something that's readily available to be used and unleash its value on demand. So you reach in your pocket and you pull out currency, and that's pretty obvious, right? Because if you had $1 coins exist, I don't know if everybody knows that, because that was news to me when I saw my first dollar coin. And if you went to buy a shirt that cost $10, you could give $10 coins, and that change would pay for the shirt. That's money. So currency functions as money, but currency is pretty much small potatoes in the context of the full money supply, because the much bigger item is your demand deposit or your checking account. And with young people, this is especially acute because young people use less currency than older people. I guess your grandparents are pretty used to using currency much more than young people are, and this might be a biased crowd in some way. But in general, people's checkable accounts are much larger than the amount of currency that they're holding. So that qualifies as money too. And then we have some other items here too. Now, if you've taken a money and banking economics course in university, you're probably accustomed to the Federal Reserve's M measures of money, M1, M2, etc. And the way that the Federal Reserve defines money is very much a legal approach or regulatory approach, where they're defining items that are included in the money supply according to how they would like to regulate the money supply. Austrians have a little bit of a different approach on this. Murray Rothbard and Joe Salerno made the greatest inroads in this, where we define the money supply, the Austrian money supply, according to things that actually function as money. What do people consider to be a generally accepted medium of exchange? What are items that trade at par value and on demand? So in addition to currency and demand deposits, there's some other items. Savings accounts can, in many cases, trade at par value and on demand. Money market mutual funds, if anybody has an investment account, would be another type of financial instrument which trades at par value on demand. And actually, as an example of where Austrians were ahead of the curve in many ways, Joe Salerno and Murray Rothbard's work on this, Joe Salerno's article is from 1993. He includes some savings deposits in his definition of the money supply. The Federal Reserve, post-COVID crisis in 2020, actually changed their definition of the money supply to include items that Joe Salerno had included as early as 1993. So we were quite ahead of I'll take credit along with Joe and say we were ahead of the curve in proper definition of the money supply. Now, when we think about banking and the money supply, then we need to think of it in the context of who provides currency and who provides deposits. And we need to think of it in the context of the two different types of banks that we have. So on the one hand, we have central banks, and a nice way to think about central banks today is that they are an organization chartered by the government with a monopoly power over control of the money supply. They also issue currency. Technically speaking, in the States, currency is printed by the Treasury through the Department of the Mint and Engraving, but the Federal Reserve is the agency that issues it into the broader economy. And the central bank has a broader role of regulating the commercial banks. And then we have the commercial banks themselves. And commercial banks create deposits, and remember that deposits are one of the key elements that define the money supply. And so these two organizations work together, and we need to figure out how it is that they work together to create the total money supply. So before we begin with the technical aspect of it, the easiest way to understand banking and the money supply is through an accounting approach. And I don't know how many of you have taken an accounting class, but there's two essential ingredients: assets and liabilities. Assets are anything that you own. I own my car, I own my house, I own these clothes, so these are all assets. They're present goods or they're claims on future goods, like a financial asset, a stock, or a bond. And then liabilities are the items that you owe to other people. They're claims against your assets. I don't own 100% of my house because I have a mortgage on it. That mortgage is a liability from my point of view because I owe that to the bank. So we have assets and we have liabilities. And one of the most fundamental elements of accounting is that your assets have to always be equal to your liabilities. So let's start with central banking. The Federal Reserve System in America was created on Christmas Eve in 1913, December 23rd. And the reason it was created was a belief that the nation should have an elastic money supply. Elastic was meant to mean the supply of money should be able to be changed by some organization in response to the needs of trade. I guess in modern speech, you could say that when economic growth happens and we're all wealthier over time, there should be more money created to accommodate this added wealth. We'll comment on whether this is necessary a little bit later, not to foreshadow too much, but we'll talk about it a little bit later in the lecture. And the Federal Reserve, or any central bank, has two roles. The first is to control the supply of money, and that's done through what we call monetary policy. And then the central bank also serves as a bank for banks. So while we all have bank accounts at commercial banks, like I bank with PNC, for example, PNC holds a bank account with the Federal Reserve, and Bank of America holds a bank account with the Federal Reserve. The federal government also owns a bank account held with the Federal Reserve. So first, let's use this accounting approach to figure out how central banking works. And the central bank's operations that are relevant for us are what we call open market operations. It's really just a fancy word for saying, how does the central bank issue currency into the marketplace? So in the simplest example, if I'm the Federal Reserve and I want there to be $100 in the economy, I just need to buy $100 worth of assets from somebody. Those assets are typically government bonds, but not exclusively. So somebody out there is going to sell me $100 worth of government bonds that they own, and I'm going to pay them by printing up and giving them $100. It's a good business to be in. If I wanted to increase the money supply further, if I want to issue new currency, all I have to do is print up $10 of new currency and go out there and find somebody who's willing to sell me $10 worth of their assets. So in an open market operation, anytime a central bank wants to increase the money supply, it just needs to print up currency and buy an asset from somebody in the economy. Because once I buy that asset from you, once I buy that government bond from you, I pay for it by giving you the money, the currency, and now it's in the economy. So in other words, an increase in the money supply, an increase in currency is always related to a central bank buying an asset, and a decrease in the money supply can always be achieved by a central bank selling off an asset to somebody in the economy and that person paying money in order to buy it back. Now here's a stylized view on what things look like today. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet from Wednesday of last week. In total, the Federal Reserve owns $6.7 trillion worth of assets. Those are comprised mostly of government bonds, treasury bills, $4.2 trillion. There's some other assets which are pretty sizable in there. I just grouped them all together for simplicity. A lot of those other assets are other types of government bonds, agency debt, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, things like that. A lot of mortgage-backed securities. And then they hold a small, what looks like a small gold holding, although it's $11 billion on the balance sheet, if it is held in the Federal Reserve's vaults. Because I saw that movie, Die Hard 1, where they steal the gold from the Federal Reserve that's an old movie, I guess. $11 billion is on the balance sheet, but it's recorded at the original purchase price, which was back in 1913. And if we revalued it, it would be almost $1 trillion today worth of gold, which is held by the Federal Reserve. That's the asset side. And on the liability side, this is what's more important to us. There's $2.4 trillion worth of US dollar bills outstanding out there. The government, through the Treasury, has a bank account that it holds at the Federal Reserve. That's $400 billion. And then all those other banks that hold bank accounts with the Fed amount to $3.8 trillion. So that's where the $6.7 trillion in total comes from. And in those open market operations, remember that anytime I want to increase the money supply, I'm going to buy something from somebody out there, it's typically a bank, and I am going to issue them currency. That was the original story. But if you sold a car to me, I could pay you in one of two ways. I could give you cash for your car, that's fine, but maybe you don't want to receive all that much cash for selling your car, and you'd rather that I just wrote you a check or did an electronic transfer to your bank account. So the Federal Reserve does something similar with the banking system. It buys up these government bonds. Sometimes they prefer to be paid for in cash and currency. Sometimes they would just prefer to get an electronic transaction that is credited into their bank account. Now, the way that this open market operation occurs, because it doesn't make too much sense that the Federal Reserve is just calling up you and you and you and you every time it wants to increase the money supply, because how many bonds are you actually willing to sell at a time? So to simplify the process, the Federal Reserve has what it calls its primary dealers. You can think of these as the largest banks in the country, like Bank of America as an example. And it'll call up Bank of America and say, hey, we're looking to increase the money supply by $1 billion, so that means we're looking to buy $1 billion worth of bonds. Do you have $1 billion worth of bonds for sale right now? And maybe Bank of America does. Or maybe if it's not just Bank of America, maybe Bank of America has got a couple $100 million and Chase has got a couple $100 million. And between the biggest banks in America, they're gonna scrounge up the $1 billion that they're looking to buy. So these are the primary dealers that the Federal Reserve actually deals with. And you might be asking the question of why government bonds? Like, why in this discussion am I actually focusing on government bonds? Is for a couple of reasons. The first is that the logistics of it is that the central bank doesn't want to buy iPhones from you or shoes because that's going to be contestable. What's the value of your iPhone? What's the value of your pair of shoes? It's nice if we can have a homogeneous product. Bonds are very homogeneous, so that's nice. Bonds pay interest, so when the Federal Reserve buys those bonds and holds them on its balance sheet, it earns interest from the government. That's one way that it can make money. And in doing so, it issues currency at a relatively low cost. And if private banks or the primary dealers don't want to be paid in currency, they'd rather be paid by an electronic transfer, there's really no cost to transferring that money electronically to the banking system. At least with currency, you incur a cost. You have to send out armored vehicles, and it's costly to move currency. But electronically, the Federal Reserve can just buy $1 billion worth of bonds from Bank of America, and at the press of a button, it can say your bank account that you hold with us now has $1 billion more. Now that's central banking. Then you get to private banking or deposit banking. And I'm going to give you a couple of different views on this. So one is the case that we call full reserve banking. And this is a type of banking that emerged Renaissance era Europe. Goldsmith bankers were who we're really concerned with here. And even the word bank, if you want to know the etymology, it stems from the Latin banco, and a banco was a bank in a public, not a bank, a bench in a public square where you would sit and you would conduct your banking activities with a banker. It was transparent, it was visible, it was secure because everybody could see what you were doing, and the word bank is a derivative of that. In a simple case, your grandmother gives you $100 for your birthday. And for whatever reason, you don't feel safe walking around the mean streets of Auburn with $100. So you'd rather deposit it into a bank that has specialized safekeeping services. They have vaults, they have security. Maybe it's also more convenient for you to do that because if you go to buy something of large value, like a house, you don't want to have to move $300,000 worth of cash to actually pay for the house. It would be much easier for you to just write one paper check or even do an electronic transfer. Whatever the reason is, your grandmother gave you $100 cash as a gift, and now you would like to deposit it in your bank. So you walk into your bank and you'd say, I would like to make a deposit. I would like to buy a deposit is really what you're saying, but nobody says that. And your banker is going to create a deposit on the spot because they're going to take your $100 and they're going to put it in a vault and keep it safe. And they're going to refer to that vault as a reserve. They're keeping it there for you. And when they create the deposit, what they do is they give you a piece of paper or an electronic notification that says, now you can come in and ask whenever you want for your $100 back. You could do that by tapping your card, or you can write a physical check or whatever have you, but this $100 that we're keeping in the vault for you is yours and you can use it whenever you would like. Now, from the bank's point of view, your deposit is its liability because it always has to pay it back to you whenever you ask for it. But luckily, the bank also holds on to an asset, which is the $100 cash that you've entrusted it with. So it sticks that in the vault to keep it safe in expectation that you will come in one day to ask for your deposit back, or that you will tap your card and the bank will receive the electronic notification that you're using your money. Now, it's helpful if you consider at this moment in time why you would actually demand to hold money. Like, why does anybody hold on to money? And Ludwig von Mises in Human Action has a nice little discussion where he introduces a thought experiment by way of what he calls the evenly rotating economy, or the ERE for short. And the evenly rotating economy is an early example of an equilibrium construct in economics, which is actually very useful. So imagine this. You live in a world where time passes, every day starts anew and continues, and then the end of the day comes, and another day starts, but every single day is the exact same. And by exact same, what's relevant for us is all of your expenses and all your revenue streams are the same every single day. You get paid $100 at 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 8:30 every single day, you spend $20 on breakfast. At 8:40 every day, you spend $15 on transportation to get to work. At 10:30 every morning, you take a break and you eat a $15 snack, whatever it is. You always keep doing the same thing over and over. It's like Groundhog Day or The Edge of Tomorrow, right? Movies where the same thing just repeats over and over and over again. And Mises says, in this type of theoretical construct, there would be no need for anybody to ever hold cash. The demand for money would fall to zero. And there's a couple of reasons why the demand for money would fall to zero. Like, if you knew when all your expenses are and you knew exactly how much you were being paid, you wouldn't have to act as an intermediary paying for your expenses. Your company or whoever you work for could just pay for those directly. Like, they don't have to give you a paycheck. They could give you some money, but they could also just pay the food store directly for the food that you're going to eat. They could pay your rent directly for you. If you rent a place, you pay so much per month. The easiest way you can get a discount on your rent is not to pay your rent every single month, is to go to your landlord and landlady and say, I'll prepay all of my year's rent right now. I'll give you 12 months worth of rent in advance. And your landlady or landlord will give you a discount. They'll give you a discount because they know they're going to be paid. They know they're not going to have a squatter just living in their house while you're there. And so they'll offer you a discount. Maybe they'll say, okay, well, I'll let you stay for the year if you give me 11 months worth of rent up front, or 11 and a half months rent. They'll give you a discount. Well, if you got a discount, you would do that, right? If you knew what the expense was, you could prepay it at a discount. But the problem is that in the real world, we don't know exactly when our expenses will actually arise. There's a high degree of uncertainty. And the reason why we hold money is to meet these uncertain future expenses, the core reason why you hold any money. So it's not for the things that you know are going to happen in the future, it's for the things that you don't know are going to happen. You make an expectation of those and you hold money accordingly. As a case in point, summer vacation period, generally people increase their demand to hold money because they go and do activities where they're not certain how much they're going to cost, or there might be surprises that creep up. If you take a vacation to a foreign country, typically you go with a higher money holding because you're not sure how expensive things are going to be, you don't know what works and what doesn't, you don't know what kind of surprises are going to happen. And one of the great advantages for getting older, you'll think it's incredibly terrible as an advantage, but it is that your life becomes incredibly boring. Like for my life, I could probably tell you down to the dollar how much money I'm going to spend on food every single week. You go into the grocery store with your list, you buy the exact same thing, 5 liters of milk, 4 pounds of butter, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no surprises, very few surprises. It's a great luxury of growing older in a developed, fairly well put together economy. And because there's very little variance or surprises in my expenses, my demand for money is pretty low. What's the worst surprise that could really happen? There's bad surprises that could happen to me. And I do hold money in expectation of those, but all things considered, I don't need to hold that much money because I can predict reasonably well how much I'm going to have to spend on my expenses. Totally different in huge parts of the world, by the way, where people are genuinely uncertain of what's going to happen to them next week, if a war will break out, if a famine will happen, or a food shortage, or whatever have you. And in those parts of the world, you will generally see higher demands to hold money as people protect themselves against these future uncertainties. So Mises' ERE is an incredibly useful tool to show us the conditions under which nobody would want to hold money. And then by extrapolation, we can determine the conditions under which people do demand to hold money. So now we get to the banking system. Because in that full reserve bank that we just looked at, we gave $100 to our bank because we didn't feel safe walking around town with it, and the bank said, I'm going to hold 100% of it in the vault as cash, what we call a reserve. But over time, a lot of bankers looked at this and said, well, that $100 that's sitting in the vault is idle. It doesn't seem to be being used. And the reason it doesn't seem to be being used is because people who are holding deposits don't seem to draw down their accounts to zero regularly. Like at a bare minimum, most people manage to keep their deposit accounts above the minimum balance so they don't have to pay banking fees. And banks look at that amount of money that's sitting in their account and they say, well, that's idle, the person is not actually using it. it's a bit of a presumption, because the reason why you have money in your bank account is because you don't even know what's going to happen in the future. It's there to protect you against an uncertain future expense that could arise. But from the bank's point of view, it says, well, this is idle and the person is not currently using it because they're not asking for it. They're not withdrawing it from the banks. And fractional reserve banks had an idea, and they said, well, all of this cash that's sitting in the vault on reserve, it's not being put to any good use because we don't really see why people are holding it. And so why don't we take it and invest it? Why don't we lend it out to somebody, and that person's going to pay us interest, or we're going to be paid for the investment. And with that money that we've made off the investment, we can pay for the banking services. We can even return some of this profit to the depositor himself or herself. And what we have is the emergence of the fractional reserve banking system. And really what it is a conjoining together of deposit taking from depositors and lending to borrowers. We're going to combine those two activities. And as we'll see, when you combine those two activities, you get some strange outcomes. So again, let's return to our accounting view on banking to see how this works in practice. Now, the key in the fractional reserve banking system is that banks do not hold all of their deposit in the form of cash in the vault or on reserve. They only hold a fraction of it, hence fractional reserve. And we call that fraction of deposits that the banking system holds on to the reserve ratio. So quite literally, it's just the amount of reserves held divided by the number of deposits that a bank has. Now, in this example, the bank that I've constructed up here has $10 worth of reserves that it's holding against $100 worth of deposit, so the reserve ratio is 10%. And the other 90% of the deposit, the bank is going to lend out or invest. And the number one loan that a bank makes, and which you will know because you'll go into your bank at some point in your life probably to take out this loan, is a mortgage. So this bank says we have $90 available to lend out, and we're just going to wait for somebody to come in looking to borrow money so that we can invest in them. And we're going to lend them these $90, and that person is going to pay us interest over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, however long your mortgage is, and we're going to make money that way. Bankers are going to make money that way, and maybe we'll return a tiny little bit to the depositor to pay them for their troubles. After all, it was their money to begin with that we're using. So, somebody walks in the bank, says, I'd like to take out a mortgage. I need a mortgage. And the banker says, well, how much, what kind of house are you looking for? And this person says, well, I'm looking to buy a $90 house because he's a boomer. And it's $90 and a stick of chewing gum. And the bank says, well, that's great because I have $90 that I could lend to you right here. That was the remainder after I put the $10 in the vault previously. So they sign the paperwork, and the person who wants to buy a house leaves the bank with the $90 and goes and finds the person who's selling the house, and they sign the paperwork and they make the deal. So now that mortgage holder owns a house, and the person who sold the house has got $90. And that person holding on to $90, they don't feel safe walking around the mean streets of Auburn either. Or it's more convenient to not walk around with $90 currency in your pocket. Whatever it is, they go into their bank. Let's say it's the Second Bank of Auburn. And you say, I'd like to deposit this in my account. So they make a bank deposit for $90. And this bank, all the banks are the same in this example. They all hold a 10% reserve ratio. So if the Second Bank of Auburn receives a $90 deposit, it says, let's take 10% of this, $9, and put it in the vault as cash. And then that's going to leave us with the remainder, the other 90%, which is $81. And let's make a loan with that to somebody who's looking to buy a house. Somebody walks in the house, somebody walks in the bank. I'd like to buy a house, I need a mortgage. Well, how much of a mortgage are you actually looking for? $81. Well, that's great because we have $81 here waiting for somebody to come borrow it to buy a house. They sign the paperwork. The person walks out with a mortgage and $81 worth of cash, finds the person they're buying the house from, signs that paperwork, a lot of paperwork involved in buying a house, signs that paperwork, gets the keys to the house, and the person who sold the house has $81 in cash now. They don't feel safe either walking around. I've ran out of space, but they don't feel safe walking around Auburn either. So you can imagine that $81 results in the $73, 90% of it, which is going to be lent out to somebody else. And that $73 is going to get deposited in a bank. And what we've got is this geometric series, right? Like if you were to count the money in this system, you would go back to your original definition of the money supply. You'd say, well, the money supply is equal to currency and deposits. Originally, we had $100 worth of currency in this economy. but it got deposited in a fractional reserve bank. So now there's zero currency outstanding. It's all sitting in a vault somewhere. And actually, those $100, if you wanted to find them in this example, you'd look at the reserve accounts. 10 of those $100 are in the First Bank of Auburn. 9 of those $100 are sitting in the Second Bank of Auburn. 8 of those $100 are in the Third Bank of Auburn, so on and so forth. So all of that currency, the $100 that was originally outstanding, is now being held in the vaults as reserves by all of these banks. So where's the money if it's not currency? The money supply now is entirely composed of deposits, because originally I put $100 in my account and I got a slip of paper that said, you have a $100 deposit. And the person who sold the first house had no money in their account, and then they got paid $81 to sell their house, $90 to sell their house rather, and so they have a deposit, a slip of paper that says they have a deposit for $90. The second person who sold their home sold it for $81, and they went to their bank and deposited it. Now they have a slip of paper that says that they have a deposit of $81, and the third house that gets sold up there is going to sell for $73. That's the loan at the very bottom of it. There's going to be somebody else who's got a deposit slip for that. And if we add up all of these numbers, all of these deposits, 100 plus 90 plus 81 plus 73 plus ... right? It's a geometric series. Each subsequent deposit is 90% the size of the previous one. And there's a limit sum on that. And the limit sum of that is $1,000. Now, we had $100 worth of original currency. That currency doesn't exist anymore. Well, it exists sitting in a vault somewhere, but we have a $1,000 worth of claims to that money, $1,000 worth of deposits. There's new money created, but there's no new wealth. Right? Like my grandma that gave me the $100 originally, she had $100 that she worked for. She provided something useful and productive. There was $100 worth of wealth. That's what's in the banking system, but the banking system has created $1,000 worth of claims to that original wealth. Now, this relationship between the amount of money originally deposited and the amount of money that the banking system can create is what we call the money multiplier. It's the commercial bank or the fractional reserve bank's ability to convert deposits into new money. And you can think of the money multiplier strictly as the number of times each dollar that gets deposited results in new deposits. The money multiplier is just the inverse of the reserve ratio. Up here, the reserve ratio is R divided by D because it's reserves divided by deposits. So in our example, the reserve ratio that every bank held was 10%. First bank held $10 worth of reserves against $100 worth of deposits. Second bank held $9 worth of reserves against $90 worth of deposits, so on and so forth. So the inverse of 10% is 10. And 10 just happens to be the relationship between the original deposit in our example, $100, and the total amounts of deposits that were created by the fractional reserve banking system, which was 1,000. 10 times the amount of deposits were created off of the initial deposit. And in general, if the money multiplier is the inverse of the reserve ratio, the greater the reserve ratio, the lower will be the multiplier. And the lower the reserve ratio, the greater will be the money multiplier. So let's just tinker around with that a little bit. If instead of holding 10% of every deposit in the form of vault cash or reserve, we only held 5%, the inverse of 5% is 20. So the banking system would be able to create $20 worth of deposits against every dollar originally deposited in it. If the reserve ratio fell to 2%, like for every $100, it only decided to put 2 in the vault and lend out $98, well, that would result in an even greater increase in the money supply. The inverse of 2% is 50. So for every dollar deposited in that banking system, you would have $50 worth of deposits created. And at the limiting case, when the reserve ratio falls to 0, the money multiplier goes to syntax error. At the limiting case, when your denominator falls to 0, the whole ratio balloons, or when the denominator falls down to approaches 0, the whole ratio explodes to infinity. So in this case, if banks held no reserves, you would have an infinite money supply. Anything that involves infinity is tough to conceptualize, but what it really means is that you would go into your bank, deposit $100, and your bank would say, I'm putting 0 of that in the vault, and I'm gonna make a loan for $100, the full amount. Well, that loan for $100 gets redeposited into some other bank, and that bank says, I'm not going to put any in the vault, I'm going to make a loan for the full amount, $100, you just have a series of $100 deposits, which is going to balloon to infinity. Now, the case where the reserve ratio is equal to 100% is the case of the full reserve bank that we previously looked at. Because if the bank said, hey, here's a $100 deposit, and I'm going to take that $100 and put all of it into the vault, there would be no effect on the money supply. The reason there'd be no effect on the money supply in this theory is that the money multiplier would be equal to 1. The inverse of 100% is just 1 divided by 1. And here you can see that in the case of the full reserve bank, there is no relationship between the banking system and the quantity of money. There is a relationship between the banking system and the composition of the money supply. Because if you go back to the definition of what is money, we've got items like currency and deposits, and full reserve banks are able to change the composition. They can change those numbers. So I go into my bank with $100 worth of currency, I give it to my bank, and it gives me a slip of paper that says, now you have a deposit for $100. Well, now there's 0 currency outstanding and $100 worth of deposit. We change the composition, but not the overall level of the money supply. Today, in the American banking system, the reserve ratio is around 20%. It's a little bit below 20%. It's pretty high by historical standards. If you think that sounds pretty low, by the way, that's really high by historical standards for various reasons. But a reserve ratio of 20% means that for every dollar deposited in an American bank today, banks are able to create $5 worth of new deposits. Now, in this example, to be charitable, no individual bank or banker creates money. All an individual banker is doing is taking a deposit from you and squirreling away a little bit in the vault and then investing the rest. That in and of itself does not create any money. What does create money is when that loan that they've made gets redeposited at another bank. So the system as a whole creates money, even though an individual bank doesn't have the ability to. Now, as Austrian economists, the very first person to allude to this process, not the exact process that I've just given you, not in technical form anyway, but the process is generally stated in Ludwig von Mises' theory of money and credit. It's a similar process whereby Mises looked at the relationship between money and money substitutes, things that also function as money but aren't money as such, like bank accounts, for example. And then he turned his attention to what he calls fiduciary media. In more vernacular, we would call fiduciary media checking accounts or demandable deposits. And under a fractional reserve banking system, Mises was able to allude to a process whereby banks, by not holding full reserves, they're able to create a new amount of money through the issuance of fiduciary media, through the issuance of deposits. Mises came up with it first, but Herbert Davenport, who's maybe not full-fledged Austrian economist, but pretty darn close. He's close enough that his name is up here somewhere around us, and I think it's in the corner over there, but it's back here. There's Herbert J. Davenport. You can't see back there, but he's right up there. So he's an Austrian economist as far as this wall is concerned. He developed the process. And then C.A. Phillips, whose name is also up here somewhere, Paul Swick, do you know where Phillips is? He's back there. Maybe he's not up here. Well, he's got a pretty good little book on the Great Depression in 1931, a real underappreciated book, I think. But he was the one who popularized the process because, by the way, in the fractional reserve banking system, if banks can create money by taking in a deposit, every time somebody asks for their deposit back, banks have to contract the money supply. Like in the American banking system today, every single time you deposit $1 worth of currency, the banking system creates $5 worth of deposits. The reverse holds true too. You go to a cash point and ask for $1 back, and the banking system's going to have to contract the money supply by $5. Now, whenever you withdraw money from your bank account, the banking system has two options. The first is it either goes into the vault, finds what cash it has, and gives it to you. Or if that amount is insufficient, it's going to call in or start selling loans. Because if you go back to the balance sheet, it's got cash sitting in the vault. Well, that's your cash. That's the portion of your deposit that it's holding there in case you ask for your money back. But it invests a portion of it too. That's also your money, by the way, right? You have a claim to it. If in our $100 deposit, If $90 are being invested in the form of a mortgage, if we ask for our money back and the bank doesn't have enough money in the vault as cash, it's forced to sell that $90 investment to raise money to pay us. So those are the two options that a bank really has. And there's some real limits on how much money fractional reserve banks can issue. Like on the one hand, there's reserves because we do demand money. We do demand cash. To focus on the seasonality of it, typically people increase their demand for cash at the end of the year during Christmas shopping season. People go to cash points more often, start walking around with more money because we're increasing purchases. People also increase our demand for cash in the summer months, especially summer vacation, because increased uncertainty, maybe a surprise is gonna happen, I'll have a flat and I have to pay a tow truck cash or something like that. We increase our demand for cash, and so banks need to have reserves on hand to accommodate that. But banks are also constrained because of our demand for currency itself, because the less currency that we deposit in a bank, the less ability the banking system has to create new deposits. So at the limit, if nobody deposited any money to the bank, first of all, banks would not exist, great. But then there would be no impact on the money supply either, also great, by the way. Now let's link together these two banking systems, the central banking system and the commercial or the fractional reserve banking system. Because here's the order of events. First, the central bank creates reserves, or currency, but more typically in the modern economy, reserves, ex nihilo. It just creates them. Like, what a great moneymaker this is. I'm gonna buy $1 billion worth of bonds from Bank of America, and I'm just gonna create $1 billion electronically in Bank of America's bank account that it holds with me. Or I could print up $100 cash. That's actually gonna cost me something, but I could do that and still it would be a good little moneymaker. And then fractional reserve banks have a desired reserve ratio. They want to hold so much money in the vault or in their reserve accounts, and so they issue loans in order to get them to the reserve ratio that they desire. And really what the whole thing amounts to is a pyramid scheme. So let's look at how it works. Here I've got two balance sheets. The top is the central bank, the Federal Reserve. The bottom is just a run-of-the-mill fractional reserve. Well, it's the whole system taken as a whole. So for the central bank, let's say that there's $1,000 worth of currency outstanding or reserves outstanding. And the reason why there's 1,000 is because the Federal Reserve bought $1,000 worth of government bonds, probably from a bank at some point in time. And those reserves, if you see, they come up in 2 points. One is as a liability for the central bank, because central bank acts as a banker to the banks. It always has to pay back those reserves, so that's why it's something that the central bank owes. But from the bank's point of view, that's an asset, something that they own. They can always go to the central bank and ask to use their reserves, ask to use the reserve account. In the same way, you can always go to the bank and ask to use your deposit account. So when you look at the fractional reserve banking system, there's $1,000 worth of reserves. And I've just got a stylized view on this, by the way, to show you a couple different common line items. We know if the reserve ratio is 10%, that the total amount of deposits that exist off those $1,000 worth of reserves is going to be 10 times. So we must be at a point where we have $10,000 worth of deposits in the banking system. Well, if there's $10,000 worth of deposits on the liability side, in the aggregate on the asset side, we need $10,000. So where are those $10,000? Well, 1,000 of those dollars are in the form of reserves held at the central bank. We're going to hold $1,000 worth of government bonds for regulatory reasons. We'll see why in a moment. And then we've issued mortgages or loans worth $8,000 to the general public. Now the question is, what happens in this banking system if the central bank decides to buy $1,000 worth of government bonds? So here, it's going to create, out of thin air, $1,000 worth of reserves. So I'm the Federal Reserve. I call up Bank of America. Hello, I'd like to buy $1,000 worth of government bonds. They sell them to me. They show up on my balance sheet as an asset. New government bonds, $1,000. How do I pay Bank of America? I'm going to credit their bank account that they hold with me, their reserve account with me, by $1,000. Didn't cost me anything, so pretty good little moneymaker. Bank of America's now got $1,000 extra worth of reserves. And by the way, the reason I've got 1,000 as government bonds originally in the fractional reserve banking system is because that's where those government bonds are coming from. But now Bank of America's got $1,000 extra worth of reserves. So here you can see that those new reserves created increased the fractional reserve banking system's reserves by $2,000. Well, with $2,000, what's the reserve worth of reserves? What's the new reserve ratio in this banking system? 20%. $2,000 worth of reserves, backing $10,000 worth of deposits, much higher than what the banking system demanded. And so what it needs to do is what it's going to do is start putting those reserves to use by making loans. And as it makes loans, the money gets redeposited in other banks and creates a greater amount of deposits. And a new equilibrium obtains whereby the $1,000 worth of government bonds that the Federal Reserve bought result in $10,000, 10 times worth of new deposits created. We've got $10,000 worth of new loans outstanding. The banks own 0 government bonds because they sold them all to the central bank. And now the banking system is back at a reserve ratio of 10%, 2,000 worth of reserves against 20,000 worth of liabilities. And you're looking at this because there's an obvious problem, which is there are $20,000 worth of deposits in this system, but only $2,000 worth of cash in the vault or on reserve to honor those requests. So if only 2,000 people go into their bank, or only people request only $2,000 worth of their money back, things are fine. But if somebody requests $2,001 back, the banking system doesn't have adequate reserves. Really what we've got is a system which is inherently unstable because there's always the threat of withdrawal. What happens if a greater number of withdrawal requests come in than we've actually got in the form of cash in the vault or on reserve? Well, there's been a solution to this. Solution in scare quotes, because be careful what you ask for. The solution that we've got today is deposit insurance, because everybody knows when you walk into your bank, there's a big sticker. It's very obvious, says this bank is insured by FDIC up to 100,000, 250,000. I'm not from this country. 250? 250, perfect, 250. Nobody has a bank account up to 250,000, I guess. But lots of businesses have bank accounts which are 250 plus. Like think about Walmart's bank account on the day before payday. It's gonna be a lot more than 250,000. And so we pay fees to banks to fund a deposit insurance system that says, if a bank goes bankrupt, don't worry, you're gonna be made whole through the deposit insurance scheme. Now I say be careful what you wish for, because what this does is it causes banks to not be prudent in how they make their investments. Because now we know it doesn't matter if the investments are safe or not. Even if this bank goes bankrupt, depositors are going to get paid back. So no depositor really cares if their bank is making safe investments or not. What people care about is that their bank, well, what do you actually care about when you go to open up a bank account? You probably look at interest rates that are offered, like how much money is the bank going to offer me for the money that I hold in it? And the way that a bank earns more ability or has a greater ability to pay you interest on your deposit is by making riskier loans. So they start issuing mortgages to less creditworthy people. They start making riskier loans because that's going to bring in more interest income and give the bank the ability to pay out more money to its depositors to attract them to do business with it. But then these riskier loans themselves only worsen the chance that assets will lose value in the future and that the banking system will require a bailout. And this is exactly what we saw in 2007, 8, 9, when the banking system started to unravel. Well, there's an easy solution to that. And that's just a return to 100% reserve banking. Take this problem away from it. But there's all sorts of objections to that. So I want to close by just fielding a couple of these objections. The first objection that people have is, yeah, but doesn't that mean that I'm going to have to start paying for my banking services? That one's always strange to me because I'm already paying fees for banking. It's not like it's free, right? There's all sorts of fees associated with banking. So one more fee to have a 100% reserve bank that's not going to go bankrupt and not systemically collapse seems not drastically different to me. But by the way, you're paying fees in either case, in any case, for this outcome. You pay a fee to cover deposit insurance right now. It's not like your bank account is fee. There's fees embedded and you're paying for deposit insurance in the case that your fractional reserve bank goes bankrupt. So you're already paying a fee. You just don't see explicitly what it's for. And by the way, if I had to pay a banking fee and it held 100% reserves, that bank would never go bankrupt. Every 10 or 20 years, there's a big banking crisis where a bank has to be bailed out. And that costs a lot of money. So instead of paying a lot of money every 10 or 20 years to resolve a banking crisis, you could just pay a small amount of money up front to cover your full reserve bank, to pay for it to warehouse your money for you. A secondary objection is that credit will all of a sudden be scarce because we know that the primary place that you go to take out a loan or a mortgage is always your bank. And banks have a great ability right now because they have a very low cost funding base. They use our deposits that they pay you nothing for, or basically nothing, at a maximum, and then they lend out that money to people who pay higher interest rates on their mortgages, and they keep the difference. But there's no need to do it that way. Why don't we just attract savings from people directly and say, put your money in a savings account, not your bank account, and we will pay you interest? Why don't you make an actual investment in somebody who's going to borrow the money for their mortgage, and then you will be paid the interest for it directly? So you remove the rents that banks own, the excess profits that banks are able to earn under the current system. Or at a limit, we have equity markets also, where you can make an investment in somebody by buying a share, and then they pay you back according to the market value at some point in the future. And both of those objections to returning to full reserve banking, they fall flat on their face, because we have viable alternatives that we've used throughout history and that we can use again today, but we choose not to. Well, I've gone over time, and I know I said I was the only thing standing between us and dinner. So I'll end it there, but if anybody has any questions, come see me over dinner. Thanks. And Peter Klein said we were supposed to follow everybody downstairs for a photograph. It's going to be downstairs, Mark? It's going to be outside downstairs, so just downstairs and outside.